Chapter 1262. In other words, the only thing that restricted Luo Fan's power in these heavens and earth, apart from the restrictions of the heavens and earth itself, was his creativity. It was just like the use of karma. Before he became a pseudo-sage, he also had the ability to use the law of karma in these heavens and earth before he truly came into contact with the application of the law of karma. However, he was only able to perfectly use the law of karma when he became a half-step pseudo-sage and encountered a cultivator who used such a method against his enemy. Based on this situation, Luo Fan should have had more mysterious and incredible powers in those heavens and earth. It was just that he had not thought of it yet, so he could not use it at all. From this point of view, those heavens and earth still had a lot of potential waiting for him to unearth. This might be the direction of his cultivation in the future. The changes in that heavens and earth became more and more intense and obvious. Suddenly, Luo Fan exerted his strength. In an instant, the light that seemed to be intertwined with countless colors suddenly shook and instantly condensed into a ball, turning into a sparkling and translucent sphere. This sphere was extremely strange. There seemed to be a vast and boundless heavens and earth inside it, and it was evolving all kinds of things that a normal heavens and earth should have. The entire evolution process was detailed and vivid. Even those who had not seen what had happened before would think of this sphere. The interior of the sphere contained a complete world, a complete space-time. This is it. Luo Fan smiled faintly. After taking a glance at the sphere, he tossed it and it directly passed through the space-time tunnel, where time and space were completely distorted and landed on the En God Sect's leader. When the En God Sect's leader saw the sphere descending, he was both excited and panicked. He was naturally excited because the sphere was that world and the arrival of the sphere. This meant that it was only a matter of time before his pseudo-sage treasure became a true pseudo-sage treasure. It also meant that it was only a matter of time before his cultivation realm became a pseudo-sage treasure. What terrified him was that the moment the sphere fell, he felt as if a complete and powerful world was smashing down on him. That terrifying pressure, that shocking impact, it had almost exceeded the limits of what he could endure. At this moment, he even felt as if his existence was about to be completely crushed by this complete world, or even completely erased. Although it had already been refined by Luo Fan, it was still a world. To an existence that had yet to refine this world, his power was incomparable. Its impact and its terror were not weakened in the slightest. Even though it had become so small, being hit by it was still like being hit by a part of the world. Thankfully, however, Luo Fan clearly knew that there was still a power remaining in this world. Although the momentum was astonishing, the instant it landed on the En God Sect master's hands, the energy exploded and completely negated the astonishing impact. The En God Sect master easily caught it, as if he had caught an ordinary ball. He had caught this world. "Thank you, Senior." The En God Sect's leader was overjoyed and quickly thanked him. Then his body changed, and his golden body instantly turned into a big mouth of nothingness. With a single gulp, he had already swallowed the world that had turned into a sphere. Previously, when Luo Fan and Nong Yu were fighting, the aftermath of the battle was too dangerous, so he had already hidden his body in the pseudo-saint treasure. At this moment, his body didn't look much different from usual, but in fact he had already turned into a humanoid pseudo-sage treasure. It was precisely because of this that he could transform and completely devour that world. As the pseudo-sage treasure engulfed the world, an inexplicable aura was gradually emitted from the treasure. This aura was extremely subtle. It didn't directly elevate the treasure to the pseudo-sage grade, but it seemed to have broken the barrier between the pseudo-sage grade and the pseudo-sage grade, giving it a sense of boundless future. This magic treasure has been refined quite well. It's a little stronger than the magic treasures of the other two sections. Luo Fan secretly praised the changes in this half-step pseudo-sage magic treasure. Although the space-time tunnel had lost its important fulcrum, due to some extremely subtle fact, this space-time tunnel was still as stable and straight as before. There wasn't even the slightest tremor, as if the world still existed and was still supporting this space-time tunnel. The root of this subtle fact was that this space-time tunnel was a change caused by the strong distortion of time and space. It was precisely because of the strong distortion of time and space that it was formed. Therefore, as long as this space-time tunnel existed, it would be in a state that couldn't be described with words. This state was relatively independent. This relatively independent characteristic allowed this space-time tunnel to exist even after that world disappeared, even though it existed because of the starry sky of the demon realm. This was just like the solar system that Luo Fan was in before he transmigrated. If the sun of the solar system suddenly disappeared at a certain moment, everyone on Earth would still be able to see the sun for the next 8 minutes, and Earth would still be revolving around the sun under the influence of the sun's gravity. Although these two were of different levels, they had the same principle. Although that world had disappeared, this space-time tunnel would always exist as long as Luo Fan and the sect master of the Yin God sect were here. Only when Luo Fan and the sect master of the Yin God sect left the space-time tunnel would the tunnel disappear completely, as if it had never existed, and it couldn't be built again in the future. Luo Fan was naturally very clear about this theory. Although the sect master of the Yin God sect had never studied this theory, he had absolute confidence in Luo Fan's strength. Since Luo Fan was acting so leisurely, he was naturally more at ease. Both of them felt that this was the case. After another 10 days, they finally broke through the restrictions of this space-time tunnel and entered a boundless starry sky that was filled with endless star essence chi. The transaction has been completed. Let's bid farewell here, Luo Fan said to the sect master of the Yin God sect with a smile as he looked at the starry sky of the demon realm. Naturally, he could open this space-time tunnel on the island at will. He could even open it directly within the Yin God sect's formation. However, he wanted to stay in this starry sky for a while now. He still had some other things to do. Of course, it would be more convenient to open it in this starry sky. How could he make himself suffer by taking care of the sect master of the Yin God sect? When the sect master of the Yin God sect heard this, he immediately understood what Luo Fan meant. He hurriedly bowed and thanked Luo Fan again. Then, he very appropriately bid farewell and left. Seeing the sect master of the Yin God sect leave, Luo Fan just smiled. He lifted his foot and took a step forward, heading toward the place that he had sensed might have a space-time tunnel during his journey. What he needed to do now was to find an outer domain and obtain the omniscient, all-knowing, and omnipotent power that existed there. Then, with the help of that power, he would begin to comprehend everything that belonged to the pseudo-sage realm and deduce everything that belonged to the pseudo-sage realm. Then, he would break through the limit of his cultivation realm and set foot on the 9 steps without the help of any external objects. He would become a true pseudo-sage. The starry sky was boundless. The distance that Luo Fan and the sect master of the Yin God sect had traveled in the process of rushing to the natural formation was extremely shocking. During this journey, not only were there many cultivators, but there were also many kinds of strange sights and ruins. There were also quite a number of space-time tunnels. In the next few days, the distance that Luo Fan had traveled in this starry sky was long enough to make any cultivator feel ashamed. He had found over 100 possible locations where the space-time passageway might exist. However, these space-time tunnels were either already marked and restricted by other powerful cultivators, or they were in embryonic form and were difficult to establish stable space-time tunnels. Or, although there were space-time tunnels, they were connected to outer domains that were too small or too desolate. Thus, they were not suitable for Luo Fan to use at all. Therefore, Luo Fan did not stop and did not enter any of the worlds. On this day, Luo Fan came to a starry sky. There were more than a dozen extremely huge stars there. These stars were relatively independent of each other, but the essence of the stars they emitted was colliding with each other, resulting in an extremely violent reaction. This caused the center of the stars to form a dead zone that would definitely injure Luo Fan if he was defenseless. Luo Fan was in a state where he could not resist at all. His body was already unimaginably powerful. Even a quasi-sage expert would have to pay a huge price to pass through a region that could even injure him in such a state. The reason why Luo Fan came here was because the terrifying essence of the stars was wreaking havoc in the center of the dead zone. The time and space there had undergone a huge change. This change caused the place to show signs of forming a space-time tunnel. There seems to be a lot of hope here. Luo Fan looked at the dead zone with an expectant look on his face. After exploring this starry sky for a few days, he had already found a pattern. Normally speaking, the world corresponding to the space-time tunnel should be similar to the environment on this side of the space-time tunnel. A naturally formed space-time tunnel was not a tunnel that was built like a bridge. It was also not a tunnel that was opened on both sides of a mountain wall. The two sides of the space-time tunnel were not fixed. The reason why the space-time tunnel existed was not because the space on this side was closer to the other world, or because the strength of the space on this side was weaker than the other side, so it was easier to build a tunnel from here to the other world. Between space-time, there was no such thing as distance in a strict sense. After all, distance itself was the concept of space. For different spaces, there was naturally no such thing as distance. Naturally, there was no such thing as distance in a strict sense. Therefore, the saying that the distance between two spaces was closer naturally did not exist. Similarly, the fragility of space. It was also impossible. Since there was no such thing as distance between space-time, then, if a fragility of space could be connected to another space-time, wouldn't it mean that any space-time tunnel that existed in a fragility of space could lead to another space-time? Wouldn't the other landing point of this space-time tunnel change all the time and even move randomly? In fact, the reason why the space-time tunnel appeared and existed was because of a kind of resonance. It was because of some special commonality between two locations in two space-time that caused a certain strong resonance between a location in the other space-time and a location in this space-time. And this strong resonance affected the structure of time and space. It affected the structure of time and space. In the end, under some kind of coincidence, a space-time passageway was constructed. And this naturally formed space-time tunnel obviously could not last long. Once the environment on either side changed, then this space-time tunnel would naturally be cut off. Only when it was discovered by a powerful cultivator, with a powerful magical power and extraordinary magic power, could this tunnel be stabilized. Only by strengthening this tunnel could this tunnel exist for a long time, and only then could this space-time tunnel not change because of the changes of the environment. This was also the fundamental reason why there were so many entrances and exits of the dimensional passageways with different environments. They had existed for too long, so long that the environments on both sides had changed and there were no longer any similarities. Although Luo Fan could not perfectly use the first level of the law of cause and effect in this demon realm, but he could see the cause and effect more clearly than at any other time. When he fixed his eyes on the seemingly invisible entrance of the space-time tunnel inside the absolute domain, he felt that there was something in that tunnel that had a great impact on him. That might be some kind of material object or some kind of abstract opportunity. What kind of existence was it? He had not experienced it personally. He was not sure either. No wonder the three major sects were so determined to choose those three space-times. I think they must have seen the cause and effect clearly to confirm that those three space-times could allow their half-step pseudo-sage treasures to sublimate and evolve. As soon as Luo Fan sensed that strange feeling, he came to a sudden realization and understood the doubts in his heart. Although he did not pay much attention to the Azure Temple, Wuyin Nunnery, and the Yin God cult, he would occasionally have a kind of doubt, wondering why they were so sure that the fixed world could allow their treasures to become pseudo-sage treasures. After all, although it was not easy to find an extraterritorial world, it was still possible to find a world that was similar to those worlds. Since they had been stuck in that world for hundreds of millions of years, wouldn't it be a way to spend some time to find another world to take a look? Now that he had really seen the space-time tunnel and sensed the existence of something that had a great impact on him, he came to a sudden realization and understood what they were feeling. After letting out a sigh, Luo Fan no longer hesitated. He lifted his foot and lightly strode forward. His figure did not stop as he stepped into the absolute domain. Although this absolute domain could already hurt Luo Fan, who could not resist at all. How could Luo Fan not resist at all? He was not testing the strength of his body now, but to enter the space-time tunnel. His body emitted a faint brilliance, forming a thin film that was almost tens of thousands of times thinner than a strand of hair around him. Such a thin film gave Luo Fan an everlasting charm, allowing his body to remain unaffected despite the boundless star essence around him. His expression did not even change because of such collisions. His figure drifted naturally, and he had already crossed the rather large amount of star essence and arrived at the edge of the faintly discernible space-time tunnel. Although the space-time tunnel was already in its embryonic form, it had not truly taken shape. The connection with the other world was intermittent, sometimes continuous, sometimes strong, sometimes weak. At this moment, it was so strong that Luo Fan could even sense the aura of the other world. But the next moment, the tunnel was completely cut off and became an extremely ordinary absolute domain space-time. Countless runes and patterns flashed across Luo Fan's eyes. The runes and patterns were densely packed, pouring down like a waterfall. If an ordinary person saw the changes in Luo Fan's eyes at this moment, he would definitely be unable to accept the information contained within, and his entire head would instantly explode and turn into a paste. The process of the endless runes and patterns pouring down lasted for more than a dozen breaths. For a period of time like this, it had been a long time since Luo Fan had reached his flawless state. According to his current cultivation realm, spending more than a dozen breaths of time to deduce something, normally speaking, could even easily find the will of an ordinary world. At this moment, he was only trying to stabilize the space-time tunnel. From this, it could be seen how important this tunnel was to him. This was also normal. For Luo Fan, the most important thing was his cultivation and his cultivation realm. Everything else, to him, was not as important as this. Chapter 1263. After a dozen breaths, Luo Fan smiled and raised his hand to slap the area in front of him where even time and space were in chaos. In an instant, countless mysterious runes suddenly flashed in front of Luo Fan. After these mysterious runes appeared, they were like living creatures, swimming nimbly in that extremely chaotic area. In an instant, they had already constructed a ring at that location. After this ring was formed, the countless mysterious runes on it began to move crazily. Endless intense light was emitted from those runes. These rays of light were extremely mysterious and profound. They seemed to be corporeal as they constantly swallowed and spat out energy from the ring's body. As time passed, these lights became stronger and more obvious. In the end, after a few breaths, all the lights connected and completely filled the ring. When this light completely filled the ring, turning the ring that was originally formed by runes into a circular mirror of light, the indescribable chaos suddenly seemed to be suppressed and smoothed out by a powerful force. Even the chaos of time and space had completely calmed down at this moment. In the circular mirror of light, all kinds of strange colors appeared in a chaotic manner. The aura that Luo Fan felt belonged to another world became unprecedentedly obvious at this moment. It even felt as if the distance between that world and Luo Fan was only a short step. This situation clearly represented a space-time passageway. It had truly taken shape and completely stabilized. The space-time tunnel was completely formed. A faint smile appeared on Luo Fan's face. With a light step, his figure instantly stepped into the circular mirror of light. The familiar feeling of the time around him completely stopped, and there was no space around him appeared in Luo Fan's heart. This was a feeling that would only appear when one entered the space-time tunnel. In the space-time tunnel, the more Luo Fan advanced, the more he discovered that the mysterious aura that belonged to another world became more obvious. Perhaps it was only because he was extremely close to this world before, but after entering the space-time tunnel, he felt as if he had already stepped into that world. What kind of world is it? Luo Fan was curious, and his heart was filled with an inexplicable expectation. You should know, at this moment, that world was very important to him. One of them might even be the key to his breakthrough in cultivation. In such a situation, he couldn't help but feel expectant. In such anticipation, Luo Fan felt that time was passing very slowly. He felt as if several days had passed. Just now, he sensed that a ball of light that seemed to contain all colors and everything had appeared in front of him. This was a world different from the demon realm, a world that was extremely important to Luo Fan. Luo Fan looked at the light in front of him and felt his heart beating faster. He directly entered the light. In an instant, an indescribable confusion completely covered him. This kind of chaos was even worse than at the entrance of the space-time tunnel. The location of the entrance was just a kind of chaos caused by the collision of different types of star essence Chi too violently, although the consequences were quite serious. It caused a great distortion in time and space. But after all, it was just a product of the collision of star essence. And here, at this moment, the chaos that had buried Luo Fan was the essence of this world, That kind of chaos came from the depths of space-time, from the depths of the rules and laws. It could even be said that it was a special characteristic of the great Tao of this world. This kind of chaos, compared to the chaos caused by the collision of the different nature of the star Qi, was more than 1,000 times stronger and more terrifying. Fortunately, Luo Fan already knew that the exit of this space-time tunnel was very similar to the entrance of the space-time tunnel. Therefore, at this moment, there was still a strange brilliance covering the surface of his body, firmly protecting him. Therefore, at this moment, although the surrounding world was extremely chaotic and shockingly terrifying, but he was not the slightest bit affected. Lifting his eyes to look in all directions, his surroundings were in a gray state. If it was not for the fact that he could clearly feel the chaotic but still existing rules and laws, as well as the existence of the great Tao that was closely related to the rules and laws, almost showing signs of merging, he might have thought that this place was the state of chaos. So, this is the world. Looking at this world, Luo Fan could not help but have various kinds of understanding flash across his face. Such a world, on the surface, looked almost exactly the same as the state of chaos. The chaos of time and space, the chaos of energy and matter, the chaos of the rules and laws, everything made Luo Fan feel as if he had seen the state of chaos in a trance. But the nature of the world was still firmly engraved in the depths of the origin of this world. This kind of inexplicable structure was something that Luo Fan had never seen before. He did not even imagine that such a world existed. Using order to simulate disorder, using heaven and earth to simulate chaos. Is this really a naturally formed world? Luo Fan looked at the world, his heart full of curiosity. The state of this world had already aroused his interest. At this moment, he vaguely knew why this world would make him feel that way. If he could clearly understand the mysteries of this world, it would definitely be of great benefit to him in comprehending the state of chaos. And once he could clearly understand the mysteries contained in the state of chaos, even if it was just a trace, it would be enough for his cultivation to make a huge leap. He casually patted the space-time tunnel behind him. In an instant, the space-time tunnel shook violently. The vibration did not only exist at the exit of the space-time tunnel, but also transmitted through the space-time tunnel in an extremely mysterious way. It directly transmitted to the entrance of the space-time tunnel, directly shattering the light mirror at the entrance. Then, the light mirror was shattered. The absolute region in the starry sky that had originally stabilized regained its original turbulence and chaos, as if Luo Fan had never appeared. Moreover, due to the effect of the vibration transmitted through the space-time tunnel, the absolute region's degree of chaos was several times greater than before. This kind of chaotic state made it difficult for the originally flickering space-time tunnel in the center of the absolute region to form, causing the absolute region to no longer have any aura that belonged to the space-time tunnel to leak out. This made the absolute region look like a star absolute region that was not rarely seen in the starry sky. Such a change. It seemed unbelievable, but in fact, it could not be more normal. Since the creation of the space-time tunnel was due to the resonance between the environment of this world and a certain environment of the outer realm, the appearance of the space-time tunnel naturally followed the principle of resonance. And the principle of resonance was that the two would only resonate when their frequencies were the same. Once the frequency of one side increased or decreased, causing the two frequencies to no longer be the same, then the resonance could no longer occur. Therefore, by the same logic, the strengthening or weakening of the chaotic state of the absolute region would change the environment. Naturally, it would be difficult for it to resonate with the environment of the other world. This space-time tunnel. Naturally, it would be difficult for it to form. Luo Fan was naturally very clear about this situation. It was precisely because of this that he had used that vibration on the absolute region in such a way. As for why he had done this, why he had completely severed the space-time tunnel, the reason was even simpler. Of course, it was to ensure that he would not be disturbed when he comprehended the mysteries of the world. It would allow him to wholeheartedly immerse himself in that kind of comprehension. Of course, with Luo Fan's current unobstructed state, as long as the world was not of the same level as the demon realm, or even the same level as the Earth's universe, then he would be able to become omniscient and omnipotent after entering that world for a period of time. At that time, if he wanted to rebuild the space-time tunnel and return to the demon realm, it would only be a matter of a thought. And the world that Luo Fan was currently of that level. So he did not need to worry about being imprisoned between that world and maintaining the space-time tunnel. In the seemingly chaotic world, Luo Fan felt completely at ease after he sensed that the space-time tunnel had been completely severed. He carefully sensed the structure of this world. Although the structure of this world was different from that of the demon realm, it did not know whether it was because of the influence of the demon realm or because it was naturally like this, but there was a faint trend of the existence of the demon realm. This trend of convergence was that the great Tao of this world was faintly fusing with the rules of this world. Although this trend of convergence was extremely slow and weak, if this trend was allowed to develop, the great Tao of this world would eventually fuse with the rules of this world after an endless period of time. At that time, this world would be no different from the demon realm in essence, except for the different forms of expression. This was obviously the reason why this world could resonate with the environment in the starry sky of the demon realm. After all, this similarity made the relationship between this world and the demon realm closer than other worlds. Therefore, it had a stronger foundation of resonance than other worlds that were not similar to the demon realm. This might be the reason why it was so troublesome to form a space-time tunnel between the universe that Luo Fan was in before he entered the demon realm and the demon realm. He even needed a level 9 pseudo-sage treasure fragment as a channel to form a space-time tunnel between the universe and the demon realm, and the reason why the space-time tunnels between the worlds that he had passed through before could appear so easily. Those worlds were almost all similar to the demon realm to a certain extent. This similarity made it easier for them to resonate, which made it easier for a space-time tunnel to be formed. After secretly thinking about the differences between the heavens and the earth, Luo Fan lifted his foot and lightly strode forward. His figure seemed slow, but was actually fast as he moved towards the center of the world. Although the world seemed to be in a chaotic state on the surface, it was still a world after all. Moreover, it was a world that was much lower in level than the demon realm. In such a world, no matter how terrifying it looked, even if he behaved like he was in a chaotic state for Luo Fan, the natural environment alone would not pose too much of a threat. Luo Fan wanted to bypass the threats of the natural environment, but it was extremely easy and simple. However, he did not come to this world just for the sake of traveling. Therefore, even if he could reach the destination that he wanted to go to in one step, he did not do so. Instead, he moved slowly. While sensing the various mysteries of this world, he moved forward at a rather slow speed. Based on his current speed, it would take at least a few years for him to reach the center of the world. Luo Fan's current cultivation realm was extremely high. He could easily sense the chaotic state outside of any world. At this moment, he was sensing the mysteries of this world. It was not anything else but to constantly compare the state of this world with the chaotic state that he sensed. Through this comparison, he could find out the similarities and differences between the state of this world and the chaotic state. After finding the similarities, he could naturally find out the differences through how the world used an orderly method to construct the similar state in the chaotic state. It was to find out the imperfections and omissions of this construction method. Through this search, he could use a very special method to understand the mysteries of this world and understand the mysteries of the chaotic state. Such a search process. Of course, it was not simple. The mysteries contained in the chaotic state, even a sage might not be able to fully understand it. For Luo Fan, who couldn't even understand the aura of a saint, it was even more impossible for him to comprehend the mysteries contained within. He couldn't even understand a little bit of the aura of a saint. Although this world was only a part of the world, a rather special Great Thousand World, it was able to simulate the primal chaos state using the various aspects of the Great Thousand World. Even if it was not as profound as the primal chaos state, it was still unimaginably profound. If one wanted to comprehend it, the difficulty would be equally shocking. Therefore, although Luo Fan would occasionally gain some comprehension and gain various principles that could help him improve his cultivation realm, he was still very far away from truly obtaining the mysteries that could allow him to break through the shackles and step on the 9 steps. However, after all, he had already obtained tangible results and saw tangible progress. However, Luo Fan was also very happy and very patient. He had even made up his mind to spend a long time fighting to the death in this world. While Luo Fan was constantly gaining and improving in that world, in the demon realm, in the center of the island where the Ling Kingdom was located, a meeting that should not have happened was taking place. The location of this meeting was on a mountain peak in the center of the island. This mountain peak was originally within the Wild Beast Spiritual Formation, or rather, it was one of the formation eyes of the Wild Beast Spiritual Formation. However, at this time, this mountain peak had become an ordinary mountain peak that was not as important as before, although the environment was not bad. The reason was that the Wild Beast Spiritual Formation had now been divided into 3 parts, and many of the formation eyes could no longer be used. Therefore, the 3 major sects, Azure Temple, Wuyan Nunnery, and Yin God Religion, had completely given up on it. This mountain peak and the surrounding dozens of mountains regained their freedom and became ordinary mountains, no longer having to bear the responsibility of being the formation eyes. At the top of this mountain peak, there was already a platform that had been carved out by a great force. Now, on this platform, there were 3 figures that exuded strong auras and were opposing each other. However, all of their auras were suppressed within the scope of this platform. These 3 people were none other than the sect master of Azure Temple, Xian Wen, the abbess of Wuyan Nunnery, and the Yin God Religion master who had just separated from Luo Fan. Yin God Religion master, I don't think we have anything to talk about. You're not asking me to meet now to show off that you have the hope of upgrading the magic treasure to the pseudo-sage grade, right? Xianwen glanced at the 2 people opposite him coldly, and finally said to the Yin God Religion master who was shining with golden light, "Show off? Am I that shallow?" Yin God Religion master smiled bitterly. "Why do you want us to meet at this time? Now that we're serious, we're still enemies." The abbess of Wuyan Nunnery was originally working hard to refine the half-step pseudo-sage grade treasure, wanting to upgrade it to the real pseudo-sage grade as soon as possible. Of course, she did not feel very happy when she was suddenly asked to meet. Moreover, more importantly, the countries that belonged to the 3 sects were currently in a fierce war. Almost every moment, tens of thousands of people were dying in the war. Under such circumstances, the 3 sects had already restrained themselves by not directly going to war. Now that they were meeting each other, he did not feel that it was necessary. The reason I called you all here is because I have a matter that concerns the life and death of our 3 sections. I want to discuss it with you all. Seeing that the 2 of them were so impatient, The God religion master knew that it was best for him to make things clear as soon as possible. So he sighed and said so. Chapter 1264. Existences of their level naturally wouldn't lose their rationality so easily because of the displeasure and anger in their hearts. Although the two of them were enemies with the God sect master, and both of them were unhappy with each other, it didn't mean that the two of them were unwilling to listen to the God sect master. Especially now that the God sect leader had used the words life and death, they did not dare to ignore him. The God cult leader nodded and said, "It is indeed a matter of life and death. The only reason I'm telling you this now is because of the hundreds of millions of years of friendship between our three sections. If you don't listen to me, I will have done my part." The master of Wuhan Monastery and Xianwen looked at each other with a solemn look in their eyes. Finally, Xianwen said, "Tell us about it." The master of Wuhan Monastery nodded. The God cult leader did not care about their attitude. He used simple words to tell them about what he and Luo Fan had encountered in that world. The expressions of Xianwen and the master of Wuhan Monastery kept changing as they listened. Sometimes there was shock, and sometimes there was disbelief. Sometimes there was panic and fear, and sometimes there was anticipation. Finally, all these emotions turned into fear, a fear that went deep into their bones. Although the God cult leader had seen Luo Fan's actions in that world with his own eyes, his expression still fluctuated as he recalled it. Clearly, he was still incomparably shocked when he recalled it, and he found it hard to control himself. Finally, the God cult leader said, "We have investigated your identity. Although we do not know why you went to such a small country to be the state preceptor, from what you asked me to send a message to you, you are very concerned about the Ling Nation. Although you only want the Ling Nation to maintain its current state, who knows when the Ling Nation will expand and unify the entire island. When that time comes, you can imagine what the situation will be like. It's up to you how you choose. I've already decided to prevent the entire God sect from moving away from this island one day. We will settle down on another island as soon as possible. Even if we have to fight with other sects, we will not hesitate." As he spoke, he couldn't be bothered to care about Xianwen and Temple Master Wuan anymore. He turned around and turned into a streak of golden light. He directly rushed into the formation where the God Society was located. This time, he told his decision to the abbess of Wuan and Xianwen. Indeed, there weren't many schemes. Instead, it was just as he had said. It was because the three sects had been like brothers for hundreds of millions of years. The friendship between them was just too deep. That lingering affection made him unable to completely disregard the other two sections. Of course, friendship was friendship. After all, their three sects were already in a hostile state. That deep friendship was only enough for him to tell them these words. It was obviously impossible for him to do anything else. Seeing the God sect leader leave, the temple master of Wuhan Monastery and Xianwen did not stop him. After all, they knew what the God sect leader was thinking. He knew that the fact that he was willing to say these words was already quite humane. How could he dare to ask for more? How much of what he said is true? The temple master of Wuhan Monastery asked. Xianwen frowned and paused for a while before saying, "No matter how much of what he said is true or false, I have decided to listen to his suggestion." I knew it would be like this. The abbess of Wuhan Monastery wasn't surprised at all. She just smiled faintly and said, "Even if I'm not worried about that day, this island can't support three sects with safe-to-be cultivators at the same time. Anyway, two sects will be chased away, and we don't have absolute confidence that we can get rid of the other two sections. Why don't we just give up on this island?" Xianwen did not answer her question. He merely glanced at the abbess of Wuyan Monastery indifferently, as if he was looking down on her scheming. He then turned around and transformed into a ray of green light that went into the formation of the Azure Temple not far away. Although the temple master of Wuhan Monastery had her own reasons for saying the last few words, it was more to scheme against the Azure Temple. Just like what she said, although this island seemed vast, it was already the limit for it to support a sect with a sage-to-be. Now that three sects were about to have a sage-to-be, it was obvious that two sects would have to leave this island. Previously, They did not realize how powerful Luo Fan was. They only thought that after they became sage-to-be, they would be able to fight against Luo Fan with the power of the entire sect. Therefore, they naturally felt that staying on this island and being neighbors with Luo Fan was a good job. They felt that it was a better choice than leaving this island. That was why they started a war and wanted to chase the other two sects away. Now that they found out from the Temple Master of Een Shun how terrifying, unbelievable, and untraceable the power of Luo Fan was, they finally understood that even after they became sage-to-be, it would be difficult for them to fight against Luo Fan with the support of the entire sect. In that case, the sect that stayed on this island would naturally become a huge disaster. As for the abbess of Wuhan Monastery's last sentence, she did not mention the dangers of staying on this island at all. Her words were saying that this island could withstand a sect with a pseudo-saint existence. It was obvious that she was deliberately tempting the Azure Temple to stay here and occupy this island that they had abandoned. In the end, they would have to bear the danger of having a conflict with Luo Fan. Seeing that Xianwen had left, the Temple Master of Wuhan Monastery did not mind that her scheme was ignored. She did not have high hopes anyway. She turned around and turned into a faint light that seemed to contain everything, yet also seemed to contain nothing. She charged into the formation where the Temple Master of Wuhan Monastery was at. The light that she turned into exuded an aura that was much stronger than before. There seemed to be a hint of an aura that surpassed one's limits. Obviously, she had obtained a lot of benefits from refining the pseudo-sage treasure these days, and she was very close to reaching the 9th step. It was only a matter of time before she became a true sage-to-be. After the three of them returned to their respective sects, a series of orders were continuously issued from the formations of the three sections. With these messages, the tragic war that was originally going on the entire island stopped without any warning. The hostile countries that hated each other and wanted nothing more than to exterminate each other's countries suddenly seemed to have nothing to do with each other. Even if they had perfect plans and were 100% sure that they could defeat the other party, they did not continue with the war at this time. The kind that was generated from the entire island. The calamity chi that was continuously gathering towards the three sections. It gradually came to a stop. The island that was originally filled with cries, roars, death, and brutality. The island that was filled with hatred. All of a sudden, everything became peaceful and peaceful. It was even more peaceful than any other time in the past. This huge change made all the existences on the island who knew what was happening on the island feel at a loss. They had no idea what was going on. Then, many cultivators who belonged to the three major sects among the tens of thousands of countries began to give up their original positions in the countries. They were either state teachers or guardian immortals. They rushed to the base camp of the three sects at their fastest speed, which was the three formations in the center of the island. Such a large-scale transfer of cultivators, naturally, could not be unrelated to each other. From time to time, some cultivators would encounter cultivators from the other two sects who would have fought to the death if they had encountered each other not long ago. However, at this time, they just glanced at each other and completely ignored each other before continuing on their way. As they got closer to the center of the island, such a situation occurred more frequently. It was almost inevitable. From all over the world to the center of the island, the combination of everyone's route naturally formed a huge funnel, and the probability of them meeting each other was constantly increasing. Obviously, it was certain that they would meet each other. On this island, there were not only cultivators from the three major sections. Therefore, although most of the cultivators who worked in the countries had already left and returned to the mountains of the three major sects, there were still many cultivators who worked in the countries and did not leave. These cultivators who were originally attached to the three major sects suddenly received an order from their superiors to completely stop the war. After that, they realized that the situation on the island had changed drastically. The disciples of the three major sects who were originally high and mighty and looked down on the independent cultivators were all heading towards the center of the island. It was as if something was chasing after them, causing them to be at a loss. Some of the more cowardly ones even directly abandoned their positions in the countries and used various methods to escape the island. This process lasted for more than 10 days. Although Luo Fan was able to cross from the edge of the island to the center in an instant, it did not mean that the other cultivators could do the same. In fact, an existence like Luo Fan was extremely rare. Ordinary cultivators, even if they were Khanate Grand Luo Realm cultivators, would need more than 10 days to rush from the edge of the island to the center of the island. It was obvious that most of the cultivators that the three major sects sent to the various countries were Khanate Grand Luo Realm cultivators. Therefore, it would take more than 10 days for all the cultivators to rush to the three major sects so that no one would be left out. After more than 10 days of fermenting, almost all the countries on the island knew what exactly happened. How did this happen? What are we going to do in the future without the three major sects? These were the thoughts of the powerful countries. That's great. Without the restrictions of the three major sects, I'll definitely be able to overturn the few sects above me. From now on, my country will never submit to any other country. We won't submit to any other forces. These were the thoughts of the countries that were not very strong, but were not very weak either. However, most of the countries were at a loss and felt like they had lost their direction. Those countries were like that, and the independent cultivators were more or less the same. In fact, they were thinking more than the countries. Why are the three major sects leaving this island? Is something terrible going to happen on this island that even the three major sects can't stop? Won't the island be in danger after the three major sects leave? Without the three major sects' control, the other sects will most likely attack. The policies they use might not be the same as the three major sections. When that time comes, won't the situation be even more dangerous? These thoughts were complicated and messy, and it was difficult to describe them all. In Luo Fan's eyes, the three major sects were nothing. It was not too difficult for him to destroy them completely. However, in the eyes of ordinary cultivators, they were behemoths. Ordinary cultivators could decipher countless principles from even the slightest movement of these behemoths. Moreover, the three major sects had abandoned the island almost at the same time. They wanted to leave the island. One could imagine how great the impact of such a huge change on ordinary cultivators was. The entire island had fallen into chaos because of their actions. It had fallen into chaos. In comparison, although the current chaos was not as cruel as the tragic war back then, the impact was much deeper. If they were lucky, the entire island would soon calm down. However, if they were unlucky, the entire island might fall into an uncontrollable chaos. Even the entire civilization on the island might self-destruct because of this. However, the three major sects, the Azure Temple, the Wuyan Nunnery, and the Yin God sect, were no longer in the mood to care about the changes on the island. Any sect, even if it was an ordinary sect, wanting to relocate would be a huge project. Moreover, the three major sects controlled countless resources and had hundreds of millions of years of history. To relocate such sects, the project would be many times larger than relocating ordinary sections. There were books, materials, magic treasures, arrays, legacies, forbidden areas, and so on and so forth. There were billions and trillions of things, and the more he looked at them, the more he would find. In the short span of a dozen days, it was only the beginning of the three great sects' relocation. If they were to relocate normally, they might not be able to relocate all the valuable things even if they spent hundreds of years. However, at this moment, the three major sects left the island in order to avoid the possible conflict with Luo Fan. It was obviously not a normal relocation. Therefore, after moving for more than 10 days, when all the disciples had returned to the mountain, Xianwen, the temple master of Wuhan Monastery, and the cult master of Yinshin sect unanimously decided that they had to complete the entire relocation process within a year. Once it was more than a year, they had to leave the island, no matter how many things there were that they had not moved. At most, they would find time to come back and move the remaining things when they left in the future. It had to be said that the three sects had a profound impact on each other. Even with such a deadline, the three sects were all about the same. They all had 1 year. With such a deadline set, The three great sects were in an even greater state of chaos. Almost all the disciples of the three sects were so busy that they even delayed their cultivation. Everyone was dismantling and relocating things all the time. Why are they leaving in such a hurry? In a certain place on the island, a few cultivators who had a completely different temperament from the demon realm gathered together. Among them, a cultivator who looked like a ball of flame at first glance, but looked like an ordinary burly man upon closer inspection, said to his companions, "I have a feeling that this matter must have something to do with the immortal master." Beside the burly man, a handsome man smiled faintly. "Haha, great minds think alike. I think so too." Another man beside the man laughed. When these words were spoken, everyone present couldn't help but smile. It was obvious that all of them felt the same way. The place they were at was a mountain peak that didn't belong to any country. It was occupied by many itinerant cultivators who had no intention of serving in any country. This mountain peak wasn't the tallest in the entire mountain range, but it wasn't the shortest either. It was in the middle of the mountain range. The concentration of vitality on this mountain peak was quite rich. Although it was far from the concentration of vitality in the mountain range at the center of the island, it was more than 10 times better than the various cultivation places in the Ling Nation. In this mountain range, almost every mountain peak had a dozen, or even dozens of cave residences. Within those cave residences, there were either strong, weak, ostentatious, or obscure auras emitting from them. It was obvious that almost every cave residences were occupied by cultivators of varying strength. There were also several cave residences on the mountain peak that the few of them were on. The cave residence they were in right now was the largest on the mountain peak. It had the best location and the most intricate structure. The Immortal Master really hasn't changed. No matter where he goes, he will definitely make a big move. I originally thought that the Immortal Master had become more low-key when he took on the role of the so-called state teacher in the Ling Nation. I didn't expect him to be exactly the same as before. After laughing for a while, one of the women said, Chapter 1265. Then what should we do next? Fireworks was still the one who asked the most questions. At this moment, he frowned and asked, What's going on? What should we do? What else do you want to do? Of course, it's to cultivate. Another cultivator said coolly. No, there might be another way. We can go to those countries to be state advisors. Back when we were serving in the Spirit Nation, you all clearly understood what official positions in this world represent. Even a small official position like that has such benefits. The even greater position of a Grand Preceptor will definitely bring us even greater benefits. Now that there are so many empty positions, it would be too wasteful to let them go. Saint shook his head. That makes sense. Although I don't know what the county head did, I don't think this has anything to do with those ordinary countries. Logically speaking, there shouldn't be any danger for us to take up the position of Imperial Preceptor in an ordinary country. The god nodded and said, Since that's the case, what are we waiting for? Hearing their words, Yenhua's face lit up with joy, and she said, We have to research which countries to go to. We came from the same place, so we can't serve in opposing countries and end up fighting each other, the woman said as she rolled her eyes at Yenhua. Flames nodded and said, Yes, yes, yes. I was confused. After some research, they each chose a relatively large country that wasn't the largest on the island. After deciding on how to contact them in the future, they each set off to search for jobs in the various countries. Even the weakest among them was a minor accomplishment quasi-sage. The stronger ones were already intermediate accomplishment quasi-sages. Existences like these were considered high-ranking people on the island. Currently, the disciples of the three great sects were gathering their strength to relocate their sections. That power was even greater than all the cultivators on this island. With their cultivation realm and strength, it was more than enough for them to seek a job in any country. Thus, in just a few short days, while many other cultivators were still observing on the island, among the tens of thousands of countries on the island, the countries that were only second to the top 3 countries, which were among the 1530 first-ranked countries, welcomed new imperial advisors. This was a new imperial preceptor who was not any weaker than their original imperial preceptor, but did not bring too many restrictions. He only needed to serve him alone. Such a change. For those countries, this was of course great news. It was something that could not be found even if one searched for it. At that moment, the countries that were originally in a state of panic finally calmed down. In fact, they even faintly felt an indescribable sense of rejoicing. They rejoiced that the imperial advisors who belonged to the three great sects had left. They were glad that the new imperial tutor had arrived at this moment. As these countries stabilized, it was as if a huge rock had been thrown into a calm lake. The shockwaves continued to spread out, causing the surrounding countries to become even more chaotic. Of course, this kind of chaos was different from the chaos of helplessness and hopelessness from before. The current chaos was a kind of panic chaos. In the surrounding countries, countless citizens were in the midst of this process. They constantly escaped from their countries and moved towards the countries that had powerful imperial advisors. Even though the countries that these citizens came from had all sorts of extremely strict regulations, they could not stop this behavior. As citizens who grew up in a country that had an imperial advisor to suppress them, the citizens' need for an imperial advisor had reached an unimaginable level. To them, an existence like the imperial tutor was like a fish in the water. They lost their sense of security. They lost their sense of security and felt that they could die at any moment. Their souls could scatter and scatter. It was because of this uneasiness that they found out that the neighboring countries still had an imperial advisor. Furthermore, it was an imperial advisor who was even more powerful than before. They disregarded everything and moved to the Ling nation to live in the country that was protected by the imperial advisor. This kind of mentality was almost sick. However, to the sky gods and the others, it could not be any better. After obtaining the imperial advisor seal, they also discovered the effects of the imperial advisor seal on them, just like Luo Fan had in the past. Compared to Luo Fan, their cultivation realm was tens of thousands of times, or even hundreds of millions of times weaker. To Luo Fan, the imperial advisor seal only allowed him to analyze the laws of the demon realm a lot faster. However, to them, the imperial advisor seal increased the power of their god arts in the demon realm by thousands of times. Although their cultivation realm increased, due to the results of their hard work in the original universe that they were born in, most of it was obtained from the aura world that Luo Fan had created using the aura of the demon realm. In the past, they had gained a lot from it and comprehended endless mysteries. However, there were still many key points that they could not understand. For example, why did this kind of ordinary magic power have such terrifying power in the description of the aura heaven and earth, but in the normal universe the power was just ordinary? Why could such an incredible thing be done with just this, but it did not exist in the normal universe? Wait. All of this was because their cultivation realm was not high enough, and they could not understand the mysteries within, or they made a mistake when executing the god art. But now, after obtaining the Imperial Tutor seal and using it to gain an extremely deep understanding of the structure of the demon world's laws, they finally understood that it wasn't because they didn't have enough comprehension, nor was it because the way they executed it was wrong. It was clearly because of the structure of the demon realm itself, which caused the difference in power and the different effects. With this understanding, the many god arts and methods that they had memorized but could not execute were all revealed at this moment. This greatly enhanced their god arts and increased their power. The strength they displayed and the power of the god arts were thousands of times stronger than before. This kind of harvest naturally made the sky gods and the others overjoyed. In fact, they were even secretly regretting their decision. They regretted not finding a small country earlier and snatching the position of state preceptor over. If that was the case, they might have been able to enjoy such benefits a long time ago. Because of the effect of the imperial teacher's seal, they were naturally more enthusiastic about the country's expansion. As for the citizens of the surrounding countries, they were extremely welcoming towards their own countries. There were even a few cultivators who tried their best to encourage their countries to wage wars and conquer other countries. Thankfully, after all, the heavenly god and the others were still rational. After discovering this trend, they hurriedly used the communication method they had left behind to stop the cultivators who were inciting war. They told them to wait until things became clear and understand what exactly happened before deciding to start a war. Both the heavenly god and the divine had extremely high statuses among these cultivators. The other cultivators naturally didn't dare to ignore their words. At this moment, the cultivators who had incited the war finally stopped, although they were unwilling. What's the reason? How could he give up such a good opportunity so easily? Could it be that there was a greater danger? Could it be that a mortal elder is really planning something big? The more the heavenly god and the divine understood the benefits of the position of imperial preceptor, the more they understood. Their hearts became more uneasy. They believed that they wouldn't easily give up on such a benefit if there was any possibility. But now, looking at those cultivators, they had completely abandoned the position of imperial teacher. How could they not feel uneasy? How could they not wonder what exactly was going on? They had no choice but to give up the position of imperial teacher. However, the circle they were in contact with had not reached that level at all. How could they really know what was going on? Therefore, although they were conflicted, they could only be a little cautious and did what they were supposed to do. A year passed very quickly. The relocation of the Azure Temple, the Een God cult, and the Wuhan Nunnery was only about 90% complete. This speed, actually, it was already unimaginably fast. The reason why they could reach such a speed was because the three major sects didn't care about losses and were not stingy with their manpower. They grasped the big ones and let go of the small ones. They dealt with those that were easy to move first and completely let go of those that were difficult to move. On this day, the three formations in the center of the island vibrated violently at the same time. The vibration affected the entire mountain range, causing the mountain range to shake violently as well. Countless cliffs and strange rocks collapsed, causing many places of interest and historical sites to turn into nothingness. Such a vibration was not concealed at all. To the many rogue cultivators who were paying attention to the three major sects, it was extremely eye-catching. Almost at the same time, all of them knew that the three major sects were definitely going to make a big move. At that moment, countless living beings rushed to the center of the island from all directions and watched the changes that were happening to the three formations from afar. As time passed, the three formations gradually began to emit three different kinds of light. One was green, one was golden, and the last one seemed to contain everything, yet also seemed to contain nothing. It was an indescribable light. The three kinds of light reflected off each other. Sometimes they would suppress each other, and sometimes they would suppress each other. Vaguely, they seemed to be carrying out some different kind of battle. At a certain moment, the golden light of the formation suddenly converged, and all the light completely disappeared. The mountain range that was originally distorted by the formation suddenly became unprecedentedly real. It seemed that the formation had completely disappeared, and the distortion of the formation on the mountain range had completely disappeared. Such a change made the rogue cultivators who were watching the change unable to react for a while. After a while, they all exclaimed, "What's wrong? Why did the formation disappear? Why did the Een God sect completely disappear? How could this happen? Why did it disappear? What kind of magic skill is this? What the hell?" All kinds of exclamations gathered into a buzzing sound. Just as they were exclaiming, in the formation that was originally emitting the golden light, there was an extremely dazzling golden light that was even stronger and more dazzling than the light emitted by the entire formation. It rushed out from somewhere in the mountains and quickly rushed toward the west. It looked as if a golden sun had suddenly appeared in the sky. As the golden light continued to rise, it gradually converged. In the end, all the light disappeared without a trace, leaving only a faint golden color. In an instant, it had already disappeared from the eyes of the rogue cultivators present, as the formation that emitted the golden light continued to change. The remaining two formations also changed almost at the same time. The light of the two formations also converged in an instant, and they underwent almost the same change as the formation where the Een God sect was located. After seeing the whole process of the Een God sect's formation, the rogue cultivators naturally would not exclaim like before. However, they were still extremely surprised and curious about why such a change would occur. What was their purpose? After a while, two extremely dazzling lights rushed out from the two locations that had become ordinary mountains. One was sky blue, and the other was a light with a color that could not be described with words. After these two lights shot into the air, all the light converged, leaving only a faint color that wrapped around the things inside. They shot out in two completely different directions from the west. Among them, the sky blue light was heading toward the northeast, while the light with an indescribable color was heading toward the southeast. The sky has finally changed. Among the many rogue cultivators, there was an extremely old man. The rogue cultivator who was only at the innate zenith heaven realm side. His words entered the ears of the surrounding rogue cultivators, causing their expressions to change slightly. Although the three major sects originally controlled the power of the entire island and seized almost all the precious cultivation resources on the island. However, it was also because of the strength of the three major sects that the island maintained a certain degree of stability, causing the rogue cultivators to not dare to fight too wantonly. That was why the island was so huge. With so many cultivators on the island, it remained peaceful on the surface. However, now that the three major sects directly left under the watchful eyes of the public, it was equivalent to taking away a piece of iron that was originally pressed on a spring. One could imagine how strong the rebound would be. One could imagine the countries that had lost the suppression of the three major sections. The entire island would definitely fall into extreme chaos, and the battles between the rogue cultivators would no longer have any fear. The old man was able to realize this. The other cultivators would not be too far behind him. Soon, more and more cultivators had already realized this. For a moment, more and more rogue cultivators showed expressions of excitement on their faces. Some of them were even bloodthirsty without any concealment. Of course, even if they were to fight, they would not do it here. When the changes at the mountain gate of the three major sects completely disappeared, the rogue cultivators left the center of the island one after another. They either went to guard against possible attacks from their enemies, or to prepare to attack their enemies, or to seize territory and resources. Naturally, with such a large number of cultivators, there were all kinds of cultivators. Most of the cultivators had already left, but a small portion of them stayed behind. They were prepared to wait for a while before exploring the ruins left behind by the three major sections. They had some guesses about the scale of the three major sects and roughly guessed that it was impossible for the three major sects to empty out everything. There must be countless resources left behind in the mountain gate that could not be moved away. Those resources might not be much to the three major sects, but to the rogue cultivators, they were definitely extremely precious treasures. Obtaining even a little bit of it was enough to reverse their fate and allow them to embark on the path to heaven. The possible gains were enough for them to risk offending the three major sections a few days after the three major sects left. There were finally bold rogue cultivators who stepped into the central mountain range to explore the ruins left behind by the three major sections. When there was the first, there would naturally be a second. In this manner, a short month later, there were already countless stray cultivators searching tirelessly in the central mountain range. Unfortunately, although they knew that it was impossible for the three major sects to move all the resources away, there would definitely be countless precious cultivation resources left here. However, so many rogue cultivators searched for such a long time without any results. Not a single rogue cultivator could find any of the resources left behind by the three major sections. After all, the three major sects were sects that would soon have pseudo-sage existences. Such sects were considered nothing in the entire Devil Realm. However, on this island, they were already a supreme and terrifying sect that any rogue cultivator could look up to. How could it be so easy for the rogue cultivators to find the various arrangements left behind by such a sect? In the next few years, the rogue cultivators stayed in the mountain range and kept searching. However, the more they could not find it, the more rogue cultivators lost their confidence unknowingly. They decided to give up on the ruins that would definitely contain many treasures and left the mountain range. However, as mentioned above, with so many cultivators, there were naturally all kinds of cultivators. Chapter 1266. At the same time the changes occurred in the central mountain range of the island, many countries on the island fell into chaos again. Of course, this chaos was completely different from the chaos caused by the three great sections. The chaos caused by the three great sects was because they were hostile to each other, so they ordered the countries they controlled to attack and destroy the countries controlled by the other two sections. There was a lot of order in the chaos, but the degree of chaos was obviously limited. At this moment, the chaos that appeared on the island no longer had any order. It was completely a chaos caused by the pursuit of benefits. That kind of chaos was true chaos. Compared to the chaos caused by the three great sects, it might not be as large in scale, but overall, it was many times more serious. The secular world was in chaos, but the cultivation world was not much better. Without the suppression of the three great sects, all the rogue cultivators repaid kindness with kindness, and the grudges that had been accumulated for hundreds of millions of years finally erupted at this time. All kinds of attacks made it, so that there were tragic battles between cultivators happening not far away from the island. Battles between cultivators were naturally much more destructive than battles between countries in the secular world. For the natural environment, battles in the secular world would at most dye the land red, or even make the land more fertile. As for the battles between cultivators, they razed mountains to the ground, buried rivers and lakes, opened canyons on the ground, turned grasslands and forests into deserts, and turned deserts into greenery. In the short span of a few years, the terrain of the entire island had become completely unfamiliar. Even if the three great sects who had just left the island returned, it would be difficult for them to recognize that this was the island that they had controlled for an unknown number of millions of years. Amidst the chaos, there was a 31st ranked country at the edge of the island, but no country dared to invade it. It was not because the 31st ranked country was powerful. For the current island, no matter how powerful a country was, as long as it did not have the protection of a powerful imperial tutor, those small countries would dare to gather together and tear off a large piece of meat from the country. The reason why no country dared to invade this 31st ranked spirit country was because at this moment, the most powerful 31st ranked countries on the island had issued a ban at the same time. They issued a ban at the same time, forbidding any country and any cultivator from going against the Ling Kingdom. If any country or any cultivator dared to violate it, then they would have to bear the wrath of a 31st ranked country with a powerful state preceptor. It was precisely because of the existence of this prohibition. The Ling Kingdom had managed to maintain its peace amidst the chaos that was much more intense than before. It was an extremely strange peace. Unknowingly, this peace caused the Ling Kingdom to once again become the place where many people from other kingdoms sought refuge. This caused the Ling Kingdom to grow stronger in an extremely strange way. Unfortunately, even then, not a single rogue cultivator dared to take up a position in the Ling Kingdom. Whether it was the state preceptor, the other guardians, or even the simplest warlocks, they were all the same. Although the entire Ling Kingdom was prospering, it had strangely become a kingdom without any cultivators. Because there were no cultivators, many of the citizens joined the Ling Nation. However, he did not have a strong sense of belonging to the Ling Nation. On the contrary, after they joined, they felt a strong sense of uneasiness in their hearts. Furthermore, they were gradually affected by the characteristics of the Ling Kingdom and became like the other living beings of the Ling Kingdom, restricted within the Ling Kingdom, and so on and so forth. To the Emperor of the Ling Kingdom, it made him feel extremely fearful and excited at the same time. This kind of emotion, in turn, affected the Emperor's imperial seal. It was the imperial seal that caused the restrictions and shackles the Ling Kingdom placed on the citizens to become even stronger. This strengthening of the shackles through some mysterious connection, was transmitted to another space-time and directly fused with something, causing the power of that thing to increase unknowingly. Although it was still extremely far from a breakthrough, it was still a good thing that there was an increase in power. The item that was strengthened due to the shackles was none other than the rune structure that looked like a robe on Luo Fan's body. While the island was undergoing many changes, Luo Fan was in an extremely chaotic space-time. The change of the robe was a gradual process, and he naturally knew the entire development process. When he sensed the change of the robe, he merely smiled and let it go. After all, compared to any changes that happened on the island, the most important thing to him now was still his cultivation, his comprehension of this world, and the many experiments that he needed to do in this world. After coming to this world for a few years, Luo Fan finally arrived at the center of this world. I finally arrived here. Luo Fan floated in the boundless dusk with an indescribable expression on his face. No matter how chaotic this world was, it was still a world, and a world that was far inferior to the demon realm. With Luo Fan's flawless and unhindered state, after entering such a world for such a long time, he was already able to form some kind of extremely strange connection with it. In this world, he had obtained a power that was almost omniscient, and omnipotent. Compared to other worlds, it's indeed much more difficult to obtain such power in this world. Luo Fan thought as he pointed forward. In an instant, an extremely strange living being was born. This living being was in the form of a human, but it had 18 eyes, 6 ears, 2 nostrils, 1 mouth, 8 arms, and 16 legs. The aura it gave off had even reached the level of innate Grand Luo. As soon as the creature was born, it suddenly trembled. It raised its head and let out a roar, and the endless gray mist around it frantically gathered towards its body. As the gray mist surged into its body, its aura continued to grow stronger and stronger. After a few breaths, this improvement finally broke through the limit, pushing its cultivation realm to the level of initial stage sage. But at this moment, the living being suddenly let out a shrill scream, its 18 eyes filled with indescribable fear, and its body suddenly undulated. It looked like there was a huge existence that was constantly struggling in its body, trying to break the limits of its body and completely explode. Then, there was a deafening boom. This powerful living being that had already broken through the innate Grand Luo to the level of initial stage sage exploded into countless fragments. In the end, the fragments kept splitting and were completely devoured by the endless dusk in the surroundings. The power of an initial stage sage's self-destruction was strong enough to destroy a large piece of space-time. But at this moment, it did not affect this piece of space-time at all. The dusk in the surroundings was still dusk, and the chaos was still the same. It was no different from before the explosion. Meanwhile, Luo Fan was already a half-step false sage, and he was even closer to truly stepping onto the heavenly steps. How could he possibly be injured by such an explosion? Faced with the self-destruction of this strange living being, he only showed a look of regret. Not even his hair was blown by the wind, let alone anything else. This really isn't that simple. Luo Fan sighed to himself. What he was doing just now was nothing else but to directly use the first level of the law of causality. He defined the power of his finger to be able to create a living being that could perfectly adapt to this world. In this world, with Luo Fan's current state of omniscience and omnipotence in this world, it was not too difficult to create a living being that could perfectly adapt to this world. If he could not even create such a living being, how could he be omnipotent? However, this was not what he wanted. He did not create such a living being for the sake of its appearance. Instead, he wanted to comprehend the mysteries of the law of causality in the process. To comprehend how the law of causality could fill in the missing process between the cause and effect that he had defined. From the state just now, it was obvious that he had succeeded. The living being was indeed born. It was born in a way that Luo Fan had never imagined. It was born in a way that was so ugly in Luo Fan's eyes. Yet, it was a living being that was unexpectedly compatible with this world. However, it was a pity that the living being had a huge flaw. Although it was extremely compatible with this world at the moment of its birth, once it cultivated and improved, and once its original state of existence was broken, it would naturally fall apart. The tragic scene made Luo Fan clearly understand that his application of the law of causality at the first level was still not perfect. Let's try again. After finding a flaw, which was the opportunity for improvement, Luo Fan was not in a hurry. At this moment, he put aside many other things and began to ferociously study the application of the law of causality. In fact, according to his guess, this might be a way for him to truly set foot on the ninth step. The application of the law of causality was something that could only be obtained after setting foot on the ninth step. In other words, wouldn't it mean that one could set foot on the ninth step if he could apply the law of causality? If it was someone else, it would obviously be almost impossible for them to achieve this. After all, generally speaking, the application of the law of causality was a fundamental ability that could only be obtained by the cultivation realm of pseudo-saints. However, it was not impossible for Luo Fan. This was because he had such a flawless state that could allow him to be omniscient and omnipotent in ordinary sectors. This state allowed him to easily apply the law of causality in these sectors, even though he was a half-step pseudo-saint. In fact, it was not just the ordinary application of the law of causality, but the more advanced application of the law of causality that could completely suppress the application of the law of causality. Because of this, Luo Fan could sense the entire process of the law of causality in advance, and then comprehend the principles within. Finally, after he left the sectors and entered the demon realm or the Earth universe, he could also use the law of causality in the same way as a half-step pseudo-saint and master the ability to apply the law of causality that only pseudo-saints could have. Various thoughts flashed through Luo Fan's mind, and a look of anticipation appeared on his face. Too Skinny also pointed at the law of causality. In an instant, the law of causality that was hard to detect was born from nothingness and directly acted on the surrounding space-time. It acted on the laws that were deeply hidden, and even on the great Tao that had a subtle connection with the laws. In an instant, trillions of changes were compressed in one place, and the many gray existences were reconstructed. They combined into an individual. It was an extremely ugly individual with 33 heads, a snake-shaped body, and no arms. The power of this body was also at the innate zenith heaven realm. As soon as it appeared, it also frantically absorbed everything in the surroundings. It continuously converted it into its own power and continuously pushed its power level up. However, Luo Fan did not care about what this ugly creature did. Instead, he quietly comprehended the trillions of changes that happened in an instant just now. He carefully dissected them, looked for the key points, and comprehended the infinite principles contained within. The changes that happened in an instant were simply too complicated. It was simply too complicated. Even if he could be omniscient and omnipotent in this world, he could only remember all the changes in it. It was simply impossible for him to analyze the many principles within it at the same speed. Endless words, runes, trajectories, Tao patterns, miscellaneous patterns, and so on flashed through Luo Fan's eyes. All sorts of information that could be understood and incomprehensible at the same time. And in front of him, the moment the 33-headed snake-shaped creature broke through the innate zenith heaven realm and stepped into the demi-saint realm, it trembled and completely exploded. This time, the power produced by the snake-shaped creature's explosion was slightly stronger than the previous one. Although the result was the same, it was clear that it was slightly better than the previous creature. Although the outcome was still the same, it was obvious that it was slightly better than the creature from before. There were simply too many changes that happened in that instant, and the information contained within was simply too much, even though it definitely contained the supreme principle of the law of karma. If he wanted to find the most crucial principle amidst the countless happiness and changes, then it was clearly not enough to rely on this change alone. If Luo Fan had already stepped onto the ninth step, he would have become a true demi-saint. As long as he searched for these principles a little, he would naturally be able to find the key to it. But at this moment, Luo Fan was not at that level yet. Of course, it would not be so convenient for him. It was like tossing a coin. It could be heads up or tails up. If one tossed a coin 1,000,000 times, one would need to know roughly how many times it would be heads and how many times it would be tails. For an ordinary person, if he knew the probability, he would know that it would be half and half. Heads would be about 500,000 times, and tails would be about 500,000 times. However, if he did not know the probability and did not know that it would be half and half, he would have to toss the coin 1,000,000 times to find out how many times it would be tails. A true demi-saint would be like an ordinary person who already knew the probability to solve this problem. At this moment, Luo Fan, who was still a half-step demi-saint, was like an ordinary person who did not know the probability to solve this problem. Under such circumstances, one could imagine the methods that Luo Fan could choose. He could only test it time and time again. He could only use the law of karma time and time again and collect the various changes that would occur in the process. Only by doing so could he find the key principle of using the law of karma from the countless changes after countless attempts. Then, he could completely master the use of the law of causality. Luo Fan's patience could be seen from his past cultivation process. He was even willing to cultivate in his magic treasure for the sake of recultivation. What was the use of the law of causality many times, even if it was calculated in trillions of years? Even if it was calculated in trillions of times, this might take a very long time. In this case, in order to save time, I might be able to speed up the flow of time in this world. Sensing the explosion of the snake-like creature in front of him, this thought flashed through Luo Fan's mind. He was very patient, and he did not feel that he needed a long time to achieve a breakthrough and become a supreme existence. However, he knew that the Earth universe could not wait that long. The entire Earth universe would welcome another great calamity in more than 3 billion years. In that time, the great tribulation of heaven and earth would blast the entire Earth and universe into countless fragments. Although he knew that this process would definitely contain countless secrets, the truth might not be as simple as he had thought in the past. However, the great calamity in more than 3 billion years would definitely be extremely terrifying, and the impact it would cause would definitely be extremely shocking. If he could not obtain enough strength before then, he would definitely not be able to control his own fate. Therefore, although he was not in a hurry and had enough patience, he felt that he could wait for a longer time. However, he had no choice but to seize the time and obtain enough strength to control himself within these 3 billion years. With this thought in mind, Luo Fan raised his hand and gently waved it. The flow of time in this space-time accelerated at an unimaginable speed. Space-time naturally included time and space. In other words, any space-time that was isolated from the outside world would definitely be isolated from the outside world as well. The time that was isolated from the outside world could naturally be sped up and slowed down according to the scope of the world. Chapter 1267. As he thought about it, the flow of time in this world began to gradually accelerate. It gradually increased from the normal flow of time in the demon realm to 2 times, 3 times, 10 times, 100 times, 1,000 times, 10,000 times, 100,000 times. In the end, when Luo Fan accelerated the flow of time to the limit that this world could bear, the flow of time had already reached 120,000 times the normal flow of time in the outside world. In other words, under this flow of time, 120,000 years here would only be 1 year in the demon realm. To other living beings, this flow of time was already extremely terrifying, and it was enough to shock them to the point of being speechless. However, for Luo Fan, who had casually twisted the flow of time that was trillions of times faster than the flow of time in the past few times, he was rather dissatisfied. However, there was nothing he could do about it. After all, he did not use the space-time formation, but directly accelerated the time attribute of this space-time. Under the situation where he did not consume his own energy to replenish it, this was all he could do. Unless he was willing to build a space-time formation here to distort time, and then enter the space-time formation, he could only give up like this. Obviously, if Luo Fan could enter the space-time formation to cultivate, why would he specifically choose a space-time in a world like this? Wouldn't he be able to choose any world at will? Sighing inwardly, Luo Fan sorted out his thoughts, raised his hand, and pointed with his finger. He performed the first application of the law of causality and defined the cause and effect. In an instant, trillions of subtle changes occurred, and then an extremely ugly creature appeared in front of Luo Fan. This ugly creature was humanoid, but its body was covered with countless protrusions that looked like tumors. It had 24 eyes on its head, and every eye was shining with a divine light that was completely different from the other eyes. This creature was also at the innate zenith heaven realm, just like the two creatures that were born before. Luo Fan did not care about this creature at all. With the help of his state of omniscience and omnipotence in this world, he completely imprinted the trillions of subtle changes that happened in that instant into his memory. The ugly creature in front of him would not stop moving just because Luo Fan ignored it, even after it was born. At the same time, it was also madly absorbing the many grayish, strange existences around it. He was constantly pushing his cultivation level towards surpassing the connate grand heavenly realm. In the beginning, it was extremely smooth as well. In fact, the process of him breaking through from connate grand Luo to quasi-saint was quite smooth as well. But after he became a quasi-sage, before the creature could show any joy, its entire body exploded and turned into nothingness. It was completely engulfed by the surrounding gray mist and disappeared without a trace. At this moment, Luo Fan glanced at the place where the creature was, and his expression didn't change at all. He raised his hand and pointed again, defining karma once more. Another creature that had completely adapted to this dusky environment was born. After this creature was born, it continued to absorb everything around it to raise its level. In the end, it followed in the footsteps of the three-headed creature from before. Just like that, Luo Fan defined the cause and effect one by one. With the help of the natural evolution of the law of cause and effect, he created creatures that were completely adapted to this world, adapted to this dusky world that seemed to be in a state of chaos. In the eyes of ordinary people, the appearances of these creatures were all extremely ugly. However, every single one of them was incomparably compatible with this part of the world, with the dusky surroundings where the rules and laws were in chaos, and where time and space were mixed with various other substances and energies. It was an environment that simulated the state of chaos. In the beginning, almost every time these creatures that were born by Luo Fan with the law of causality broke through the primordial zenith heaven realm and became a sage to be, they couldn't perfectly maintain the absolute adaptation to the surrounding environment. Their entire bodies exploded with a loud bang, and all their existences were completely wiped out. However, after hundreds of thousands of times, the creatures that were born finally broke through this threshold. Finally, they didn't explode with a loud bang when they just stepped into the sage-to-be realm and became a sage-to-be, and all their existences were completely wiped out. But after they broke through the sage-to-be realm and became a sage-to-be, they finally exploded with a loud bang. All the fragments were completely engulfed by the dusky surroundings, and all their existences were completely wiped out. By this time, more than a dozen years had passed. After hundreds of thousands of times of defining the cause and effect to apply the law of causality, Luo Fan gradually suppressed many other distracting thoughts. Unknowingly, what he was thinking about and concerned about was the billions and trillions of changes that the law of causality used to complete the process between the cause and effect. These changes were extremely subtle and contained many principles of the law of causality. These changes were unimaginably complicated. Moreover, if one tried to comprehend them, there was no distinction between the key points and the secondary points. It was difficult to find or extract the key principles of the law of causality from them. However, just like reading a book 100 times, the meaning would appear on its own. As the process of applying the law of causality accumulated more and more times, an inexplicable feeling gradually appeared in his heart. This feeling couldn't be described with words. It was almost like an instinct, and he faintly felt that he was about to grasp the key principles. Of course, this feeling was still very vague. Hundreds of thousands of times seemed to be an extremely terrifying number. If it was in the mortal world, anyone who wielded a saber hundreds of thousands of times would definitely become a saber technique grandmaster. However, if these hundreds of thousands of times were included in the trillions and trillions of changes, it would be nothing. It was already extremely rare to be able to produce such a vague feeling through the process of these hundreds of thousands of times. It was obviously impossible to fully grasp this feeling and fully possess the ability to apply the law of causality at the first level. However, although there was still a long way to go before he could fully grasp it, he was still improving, after all. After all, it was a good thing. Regarding this, Luo Fan occasionally came back to his senses. He would feel a sense of elation. It was precisely because he had gradually developed this vague feeling that the living beings he created with the law of causality were able to adapt to their surroundings and become more and more powerful. Time gradually passed in this process. 100 years, 1,000 years, 10,000 years. 100,000 years had passed unknowingly. During these 100,000 years, Luo Fan was like a robot. He only knew how to raise his hand, point out, and retract his finger. After a while, he raised his hand again and pointed out, and then retracted as he moved. Living beings that were extremely ugly in the eyes of ordinary people were born one after another. They crazily absorbed the power around them and continuously strengthened themselves. Soon, they exploded. All of their existences were completely erased. 100,000 years passed just like that. The number of living beings created by Luo Fan, it had already exceeded trillions. If these living beings did not explode like that, perhaps the entire world would have been filled with such ugly living beings. Of course, almost all of the living beings exploded not long after they were created. But among them, there were extremely few living beings who were extremely lucky and survived. Over the 100,000 years, among the trillions of living beings that Luo Fan created, there were at least 23 such living beings. These 23 living beings had different forms. Some were humanoid, but they had all sorts of special organs on their bodies. Some had many eyes, some had abnormal bodies, some had many hands and feet, and some even had many wings and other organs that only birds and beasts would have. Some did not have a humanoid appearance at all. They came in all shapes and sizes, as if they were formed by mixing all kinds of living beings that existed in the normal world with some strange methods. Now, the strength of these 23 living beings had reached the level of advanced stage quasi-saint. Furthermore, they were still frantically absorbing the grayish existence in the surroundings during this process, trying their best to raise their strength and level. They were the most successful of the trillions of creatures that Luo Fan had created in the past 100,000 years. They were the most adapted to the surrounding environment. Of course, most of them probably had not reached the limit of their endurance in this environment. In other words, the reason why they had not exploded was that they had not reached the level where they could explode. Perhaps they had reached the pinnacle of the Sage-to-Be level or even higher. Then they would still explode like the many living beings in the past. However, no matter what, this represented a kind of progress, a stronger kind of progress than the trillions of living beings that had exploded. After repeating this process for more than 1 trillion times in the past 100,000 years, the trillions of changes that had taken place in the process of completing the law of cause and effect had finally been completely integrated into Luo Fan's mind. The feeling that he had grasped the key principle and turned this process into an instinct, and that he could fully perform it without the help of the world had also been strengthened to a limit. It was a boundary that could be broken through with just a thin membrane, and it could instantly turn this feeling into reality. As long as he broke through this limit, Luo Fan believed that he could completely grasp the first application of the law of cause and effect. Without the help of any vast thousand worlds, he could perform the first application of the law of cause and effect in any perfect world or the demon realm, and obtain the power that could only be obtained after stepping on the 9th step. However, this thin membrane was unexpectedly tough. It was so tenacious that he felt that no matter how many times he repeated it, even if he spent countless times more than 100,000 years, he still wouldn't be able to pierce through this thin film, completely break through that boundary, and truly turn this feeling into reality. This feeling made Luo Fan gradually break away from the state of being completely immersed. Only one step away, Luo Fan sighed, showing an indescribable depressed look on his face. He looked at the 23 living beings that were crazily absorbing the grayish existence not far away, constantly improving their strength and level, and his expression couldn't help but become much better. These living beings were the results of his experiments in the past 100,000 years. Of course, it would be too exaggerated to say that they were like his children, but no matter what, they had reached the level of pets. Under such circumstances, when he saw these 23 living beings, his mood naturally became much better. If I set them free, perhaps they could naturally open up some small thousand worlds, medium thousand worlds, or even vast thousand worlds in this simulated chaos state. At that time, wouldn't they be existences similar to Pangu? Suddenly, Luo Fan's heart stirred as he thought of this. As soon as this thought appeared, he couldn't help but feel an inexplicable anticipation in his heart. According to this line of thought, the living beings born in the world they created might treat them the same way the living beings in the primordial world treated Pangu, and they would become existences similar to saints in those worlds. Thinking of this, Luo Fan raised his hand and pointed at the 23 living beings. In an instant, the 23 living beings each stopped the process of absorbing the grayish existence around them, which had lasted for an unknown period of time. Slowly, they opened their eyes, which were not fixed in number. As if they had just woken up from a deep sleep, their eyes were filled with confusion, curiosity, and other emotions. Luo Fan thought for a while, then completely concealed his figure and aura, and quietly stayed in the center of this world. He wanted to see what they would do. The current forms of these living beings were not set by Luo Fan. They had all the knowledge. All the thoughts were not given by Luo Fan. Therefore, to these living beings, they were born from this grayish existence, and this grayish existence was their home. The living beings around them felt close to them, but they also felt repulsed. It was as if they had an extremely close relationship with each other, but they could not coexist peacefully. Soon, these living beings began to test each other. They did not speak, and even their wills were extremely chaotic. In Luo Fan's eyes, that kind of test was naturally clumsy beyond imagination. However, it was a necessary process for intelligent living beings to interact. It meant that they gradually gained wisdom, and it meant that they were gradually moving in the direction that Luo Fan had expected. Perhaps Pangu and the others were in a similar state back then. Luo Fan watched the actions of these living beings with great interest. At this moment, his grasp of the first layer of the law of causality was completely stuck before the final thin membrane. This thin membrane could not be broken through by repeating the same method. It was like the question of how many heads and tails would there be if you tossed a coin 1,000,000 times. An ordinary person who did not know the probability would have to toss the coin 1,000,000 times to ascertain the specific answer to this question. To know that the number of times in both cases would be 1/2, one would have to turn one's brain around to be able to do so. Otherwise, even if he tossed the coin 1,000,000 or 10,000,000 times, he would not be able to get the number that was 1/2. At this very moment, what Luo Fan lacked was this final twist. Under such circumstances, Luo Fan naturally could not continue the process of defining causes and effects to create living beings to break through this thin membrane. Of course, since he could not create complex things like living beings, it was even more impossible to use the law of causality to create other things. He let go of the 23 living creatures, allowing them to move freely in this world that simulated a state of chaos. He wanted to see what choice they would make, whether they would really open up a world in the end, whether they would really treat this world as a state of chaos, and let many worlds brimming with vitality appear in this world. He wanted to see if he could find any patterns in them and what effect the living beings he created would have on the future. He wanted to find out if there were any principles of the law of causality involved. This method was like measuring an extremely tiny distance and magnifying it in various ways before measuring it again. It was by looking at the effects of some tiny differences in the execution of the law of causality and comprehending the many principles involved when the law of causality was in effect. Of course, this kind of hope was quite slim, that was for sure. But now, Luo Fan was interested in how these living beings would choose, and waiting for the final result was secondary. If that was the case, what reason did he have not to do so? What happened next made Luo Fan's expression change slightly. After the 23 creatures clumsily probed each other, they scattered in all directions. Like headless flies, they scattered all over the world. After scattering to different places, the living beings settled down. After they settled down, they began to comprehend the world and their own bodies. They constantly dug out all kinds of ways to use power from their bodies and the world around them, and gradually created all kinds of divine abilities. Among the magical abilities they had created and the methods of using power that they had unearthed, although the vast majority of them were clumsy and rubbish in Luo Fan's opinion. However, from time to time, there would be a method or ability that even Luo Fan could not help but gasp in amazement at. They displayed unbelievable talent and comprehension. Whether the methods and abilities were exquisite or clumsy, every single one of them was extremely compatible with this world, and every single one of them could have an effect on the gray, chaotic state around them. Chapter 1268. Although there was a normal flow of time in this world, time, space, matter, energy, and so on were in an extremely chaotic state. Therefore, for the living beings that were born in this world and were completely compatible with this environment, time seemed to be something that did not exist at all. When they were together, they would naturally be in the same time dimension because of the influence of each other. However, when they were separated, their respective time dimensions would gradually deviate due to the unique time state in the outside world. For some living creatures, time seemed to pass extremely slowly, while for others, it was unimaginably fast. In Luo Fan's perception, 1 hour was already millions of years for some living creatures, but it was just a moment for some living creatures. This difference was beyond Luo Fan's imagination. At least, in the past, Luo Fan had never imagined that an existence like time could actually change like this because of the cognition of living beings. The flow of time in this world should be fixed, which was 100,000 times that of the demon realm and 100,000 times that of the earth. Normally, the speed of time that living creatures in this world should be the same. However, the reality that was happening at this moment had completely shattered his original thoughts. The flow of time that every living being experienced was actually different just because they had different understandings of time. How could this be? This thought flashed across Luo Fan's mind as he looked at the changes of the 23 living creatures. Faintly, he suddenly had an inexplicable feeling that time did not seem to be as simple as he had imagined at this moment. He was extremely glad that he had allowed the 23 living creatures to live and cultivate freely in this world. After only a few days, one of the 23 living creatures was in human form. However, the living creature with 6 arms, 2 legs, and 12 eyes had already lived for tens of millions of years. Over the past tens of millions of years, this creature had comprehended some kind of cultivation method that made even Luo Fan exclaim in admiration through its understanding of itself and its surroundings. It had even directly relied on this kind of cultivation method to do so. It even relied on this cultivation method to break through the limit and enter the peak of the sage-to-be realm from the initial great accomplishment. The moment it reached the peak of the sage-to-be realm, the living creature suddenly roared at the sky. The roar contained a strong sense of unwillingness, indescribable loneliness, and an extremely strong sense of death. Luo Fan looked at the state of the living creature and sighed. He sighed, knowing that this living being had reached its limit. Its essence could only allow it to cultivate to this level in this world and achieve such a remarkable ability. Next, there was only one fate that awaited it, which was to collapse. All the grayish existences that it had absorbed previously returned to this space-time in this world. After cultivating for tens of millions of years, the living creature was already clear about this. It was precisely because of this that it was so disgruntled, so lonely, and so filled with the intent to die in that roar of its. What a pity! Seeing this, Luo Fan secretly sighed. If Luo Fan had created the living creature himself, he would have been able to make it more perfect. It would have been able to cultivate to a higher level. However, it was a pity that the living creature was formed by the law of cause and effect, which was also determined by the essence of this world. If Luo Fan had created the living creature, he would have been able to make it more perfect. It would have been able to live longer and cultivate to a higher level. However, it would have been impossible for the living creature to have all the characteristics that made Luo Fan sigh in admiration. It would have been impossible for it to comprehend many methods of using power and remarkable abilities that made him sigh in admiration. It would have been even more impossible for it to experience time differently than this world due to its different understanding of time. It was the normal time of this world. Without these 2 points, the living creature would just be Luo Fan's toys. There was no meaning for it to exist. The living creature naturally did not know that an existence like Luo Fan was watching and lamenting at the side. After letting out a loud roar, it raised both of its hands that had 10 fingers. With a sudden pull, a large sword was grasped by it. Once the big sword appeared, it let out a loud roar and swung the big sword forward. In an instant, a terrifying gray rumble that shook the entire world appeared out of nowhere. Amidst the rumbles, the remaining 2 living beings that had been scattered to different parts of the world shuddered. Their time dimensions were unknowingly twisted by the sound and pulled to the same level as the living being that was slashing at the gray existence in front of it with the giant sword. Following that, all the living creatures instantly understood. It's going to split open the sky. With this understanding, all the living creatures rushed towards the location of the living creature in a frenzy. However, the living creature that was holding the sword did not stop. After swinging the sword once, it swung it a second time, a third time, a fourth time. As it moved, the gray existence in front of it started to change. The originally chaotic time, space, matter, and energy were gradually separated. The countless chaotic laws were gradually smoothed out. However, this separation and smoothness was completely unlike what Luo Fan had seen in the past. It was not the kind of separation and smoothness that would appear in a normal world. A small, orderly space-time gradually appeared in front of the living creature and was opened up by the sword. That space-time had the appearance of a round sky and a square earth. Although the entire space-time was narrow and only the size of a thumb in Luo Fan's eyes, its interior was all-inclusive. If one were to drill into it, they would even be able to see the boundless space and endless matter. The narrow space-time that had just been opened up was a barren wasteland. The endless grayish existences around frantically squeezed the space-time and seeped into it. They wanted to assimilate the space-time and turn it back into a grayish world. Seeing this, the living creature raised its hand and thrust the sword in its hand into the space-time. The sword was only the size of an ordinary sword in the living creature's hand. Compared to the extremely narrow space-time outside, it was tens of thousands of times larger. However, when the living creature gently thrust the sword into the space-time, it did not hold back at all. It was completely inserted into that space-time, directly into the middle of the continent inside that space-time. Its top was supporting the sky, and its bottom was supporting the ground. It firmly withstood the pressure from the surrounding boundless gray existence that was constantly pressing towards the center, gradually merging the sky and the ground into one, making the sky and the ground of that world. Although the sky and the ground trembled continuously during this process, they would no longer merge completely. Thus, the space-time gradually stabilized. After the space-time stabilized, a seemingly gratified expression appeared on the living creature's 12-eyed face. Its body swayed as if it was about to fall. It forced itself to stand up straight and pondered for a moment. It took a step forward and directly walked into that space-time. Although the space-time inside was boundless, it was only inside the space-time. For the living creature that was born in this simulated primal chaos, the space-time was still too narrow. After the creature entered, it seemed to be able to support the heavens and the earth. The entire space-time seemed to be under great pressure because of its existence. The entire space-time swayed slightly and vibrated gently. It looked as if it was going to completely collapse in the next moment. The living creature looked at the space-time it created in an intoxicated manner. Finally, it could no longer support itself and could not maintain its body's integrity. It slowly fell to the ground. This fall caused the space-time to violently tremble. Fortunately, the huge sword at the center of the space-time held up the world. Otherwise, just this fall alone would have caused the entire space-time to collapse. After the living creature fell like this, its entire body slowly disintegrated. However, this time, it was no longer disintegrating like the creatures that had disintegrated in the outside world. It was no longer turning back into a grayish existence. It was completely engulfed by the surroundings and finally disappeared without a trace. This time around, it disintegrated and transformed into that heaven and earth. The countless things in the space-time, the sun, moon, stars, mountains, rivers, flowers, trees, and even its own blood essence turned into endless living creatures that splashed across the entire space-time. The entire world became full of vitality in the blink of an eye, no longer in the wild, lonely, and primitive state from before. As Luo Fan watched the entire process, he had an inexplicable feeling in his heart. A faint smile gradually appeared on his face. Back then, Pengu might have created the primordial world in this way. The other creators of perfect worlds might have used a similar method and created so many perfect worlds for almost the same reason. As this thought flashed through his mind, all the vague thoughts he had before suddenly strung together, making Luo Fan unable to help but laugh out loud. However, there was an inexplicable feeling and helplessness in his laughter. So it turns out that the state of chaos is probably just a part of a higher level of heaven and earth. Perhaps all of us cultivators, even sages, are just frogs at the bottom of a well that can't see the truth at all. Now, there might even be an incredible living creature looking at the entire state of chaos with a probing gaze. It's looking at the endless sages, cultivators, and everything that is happening in the endless perfect world. The more Luo Fan thought about it, the more he laughed. Everything that happened in this world was completely the result of the law of causality. The only thing that Luo Fan intervened in was the direct definition of the birth of a living creature that was completely adapted to this gray environment. The other changes in the living creatures, the improvements in the living creatures, the choices they made, and everything else was completely the will of those living creatures. In other words, the changes that happened in this world were completely the result of the development of this world. It had nothing to do with whether this gray state was the real state of chaos, whether it was really boundless, and whether it was really everything outside of the world like what he had known in the past. From this point of view, the state of chaos outside the Earth universe, the primordial world, the Tianyuan world, and even the Jili world might be of the same nature as the gray state in this world, or it might just be a simulation of the real state of chaos. As for why it seemed so real and incredible, it was even simpler. It could be perfectly explained by the difference in the level of simulation. As he laughed out loud, the time and space around Luo Fan suddenly began to change subtly. Time was sometimes fast and sometimes slow, and space was sometimes big and sometimes small. It was almost like breathing or a heartbeat. However, the changes in time and space were completely autonomous. It was not caused by Luo Fan using his own power to distort time and change space like in the past. Instead, space and time were autonomous changes. It was as if Luo Fan's own space-time attribute had changed. Luo Fan's whisper gradually stopped, and the expression on his face became calm again. After all, he was a half-step pseudo-sage existence. Although the inference just now was subversive enough, it only caused a little turbulence in his heart. After a while, he had completely calmed down. His mind returned to its original state. At this moment, the time and space that were fluctuating like breathing and heartbeat around his body also stabilized at the same time. Needless to say, the space formed a circle around his body, forming a humanoid state that completely enveloped his body. As for time, it was completely independent of the flow of time in the outside world. Instead, it directly accelerated to the level of the living creature that had created the world in this world. In other words, the fixed time in this world in a few days was equivalent to tens of millions of years. Compared to the Earth universe and the demon realm, such a speed of time flow had already reached an unimaginable level. So that's it. Luo Fan raised his hands in front of him and looked at them. An inexplicable smile appeared on his face. His hands suddenly opened and closed, and he muttered these words. As he said this, the flow of time began to accelerate again. With the current flow of time as the base, it began to increase by 10 times, 100 times, 1,000 times, 10,000 times. When it was almost countless times, even all the changes in the outside world seemed to have completely stopped. Even with his current eyesight, he could not see the speed of time in the outside world. With a thought, the flow of time that he felt began to slow down. He saw that the time in the outside world had also begun to change. It began to gradually speed up, gradually speeding up from its original undetectable speed all the way until it seemed to be running. In this way, it finally slowed down to 100,000 times slower than the outside world. In other words, it was at the same level as the flow of time in the demon realm before he stopped. In this state, he looked around and saw that everything was developing at a speed that was 100,000 times faster than normal. The worlds that the 22 living beings had opened up also appeared in this world, in the midst of the gray and hazy existence. In fact, the worlds created by these living beings were constantly developing in the process. Some grew to become tens of thousands of times more powerful than when they were first created, while others naturally collapsed, fell, and completely disappeared in the process of development. Due to the different attributes of time and space, these worlds naturally produced all kinds of tribulations. Every once in a while, these tribulations would be thrown at those worlds, constantly scouring those worlds and testing them. If those worlds could withstand the scouring and testing of these tribulations, they would naturally turn the scouring power into their own power. Their essence would be greatly improved, and the attribute of time and space would gradually move closer to the attribute of time and space that simulated the state of chaos. In other words, the flow of time in that world would gradually move closer to the world that simulated the state of chaos. The stability of the space, the state of the laws, and so on would all move closer to the outside world. In this way, after the world withstood several tribulations, the attribute of time and space would be completely the same as the attribute of time and space in the outside world. At that time, because the inside and outside world were the same, there would naturally be no more tribulations thrown at these worlds, and these worlds would be able to exist in this world for a long time. As Luo Fan looked at the changes in these worlds, he suddenly understood what was going on with the great tribulation of the world that the perfect world had encountered, and he also understood what was going on with the big world. Great tribulation of the world. Great tribulation of the world. Luo Fan sighed. With a slight thought, the flow of time in his body began to gradually accelerate. Soon, it accelerated to the same level as the flow of time in this world that simulated the state of chaos. At this moment, the flow of time in the world created by the first living creature had already slowed down to the same level as the flow of time in this world. In other words, it was also 100,000 times faster than the demon realm and the Earth's universe. The size of this world had already grown from that tiny level to a level that was almost as large as Luo Fan. If the living creature that had created this world entered this world again, it would no longer be able to cause the entire world to shake violently like before. It might even cause the entire world to explode. Now, if that living creature entered again, it would not even cause any movement. Chapter 1269. Apart from his own comprehension of that world, Luo Fan's deduction was mostly due to the fact that quite a number of beings who had reached the pinnacle of the Sage-to-Be realm had been born in that world recently. In fact, the pinnacle of the Sage-to-Be realm was already considered the pinnacle in that world, or even in many other worlds. The power they possessed in that world was equivalent to the power that Luo Fan possessed in that world, and the power that a sage possessed in a perfect world. With that kind of power, those living beings could already transcend the world that they were born in. Each of them had opened up a small world around that world and attached themselves to that world. They were detached from a world and controlled all kinds of general trends in that world. It was also with the help of those pinnacle of the Sage-to-Be realm cultivators that the world could withstand the scourge and test of those worlds and grow to a level where even the space-time property was similar to that of the outside world, which was in a state of chaos. Due to the existence of those pinnacle of the Sage-to-Be realm living beings, the boundless, murky world that seemed to be in a state of chaos collapsed because a few worlds could not withstand the test of those worlds. However, there were still many more worlds in that world. Moreover, the number of worlds was still increasing with the passage of time. In Luo Fan's eyes, these years were like marbles distributed in a vast void, which added a lot of vitality to the murky world and gradually changed the monotonous state of the world. Just as Luo Fan had speculated, the living beings that were born in these worlds were based on the body and image of the powerful living beings that had opened up the world. In the end, when all the cultivators cultivated to the most powerful level, even if they did not originally have that image, they would naturally evolve into that image. Only in this way could they truly reach the pinnacle. To reach the pinnacle of the Sage-to-Be realm. Therefore, although there were more and more worlds in this gray and hazy world, there were only 23 types of orthodox living beings that were born in them. In other words, there were more than 23 types of born Taoism aptitudes that could adapt to a certain world. They were also the 23 types of creatures that Luo Fan had created using the law of causality. It was quite normal. The 23 creatures created by Luo Fan had opened up those worlds. Since that was the case, those worlds naturally contained the auras of the 23 creatures. The cultivation principles and orthodoxies within those worlds would naturally be influenced by their auras. He had completely adapted to that aura. Those who couldn't adapt to the aura would naturally fall along the way. As this continued, the image of the 23 creatures was regarded as orthodox and was valued by all cultivators. This was the perfect situation in the outside world. It was obvious that they were very similar. As expected, it is a complete correspondence. Luo Fan observed the changes to the world before him, and an inexplicable smile appeared on his face. With a slight thought, the flow of time in his body began to slowly increase. 1 time, 2 times, 10 times, 100 times. In the end, it increased to 100,000 times, which was the same level as the original time attribute in this world. Only then did it stop. After increasing the flow of time to this level, it didn't feel too special at first. But after waiting for a while, an indescribable feeling surged up. This fleeting feeling made him feel as if the position he was standing on was very fragile, as if it could collapse at any time, and he could fall at any time. As expected, I still can't completely offset the influence of the outside world. Luo Fan felt this inexplicable drift, and instantly knew where it came from. This kind of inexplicable drifting was fundamental. It was because of the influence of the time essence of the entire Earth's universe. The Earth universe was a perfect world. Its essence might not be much stronger than that of the demon realm, but compared to the world that Luo Fan was in at this time, it was countless times better than this world that completely simulated the state of primal chaos. Such a level of difference. As a result, this world would definitely be affected by the entire Earth at all times. Naturally, the time attribute was also within the scope of being affected. This kind of influence wasn't too great, and it wouldn't make it impossible for this world to change its own flow of time, but it still existed. After all, it was an influence between two things that were extremely different. This world changed the flow of time, and this was carried out against this influence. Naturally, there would be a feeling of drifting and unsteadiness. This was like running at high speed on the Earth that was constantly rotating. Because of the difference between one's movement and the Earth's rotation speed, there would also be a kind of unsteadiness and a feeling of drifting. Regarding this feeling of drifting, Luo Fan only felt it for a while, and then put it aside. This feeling was inevitable, but he didn't need to stop eating for fear of choking, because the appearance of this feeling would slow down the flow of time in this world to the same speed as the flow of time in the Earth universe. It was just like how running would produce that feeling of drifting and unsteadiness, but no one would give up running because of this feeling. With a slight thought, Luo Fan raised his hand and pointed forward. In an instant, an indescribable feeling flowed through his heart. The trillions of changes that seemed inexplicable and completely incomprehensible suddenly became incomparably clear at this moment. Everything seemed to have become as simple as common sense. So this is the profundity of the first level of the law of causality. An indescribable smile appeared on Luo Fan's face as he muttered. At that moment, a living creature appeared in front of him in the direction he was pointing at. It had 3 heads and 6 arms and 3 eyes on its face. The expressions on its 3 heads were different. One was joyful, one was angry, and the last one was merciful. This creature wasn't at the innate Grand Luo realm, but at the initial stage of the quasi-saint realm. As soon as it was born, it began to madly absorb the endless grayish existences in its surroundings. It kept growing, and its strength kept increasing. Very soon, after absorbing an unimaginable amount of grayish existences, it broke through its limit and stepped into the initial stage of the quasi-saint realm. It was at this moment that it didn't show any signs of unsteadiness. Instead, the speed at which it absorbed the grayish existences continued to increase, and its strength increased rapidly. After twice as long as before, it broke through the barrier between the initial stage of the quasi-saint realm and the intermediate stage of the quasi-saint realm, and truly stepped into the intermediate stage of the quasi-saint realm. After stepping into this realm, it still didn't show any signs of unsteadiness. It continued to absorb the grayish existences in its surroundings, and its strength continued to increase. This happened again and again. In just a few days, this creature actually broke through layers of barriers from the initial stage of the quasi-saint realm. It directly reached the peak stage of the quasi-saint realm. Moreover, even after reaching this level, this creature still seemed to be at ease and didn't show any signs of unsteadiness. With one look, anyone could tell that this level was still not its limit. It still wasn't its limit. Its essence was that it could still continue to increase its strength. After reaching the peak of the quasi-saint realm, this creature stopped absorbing the grayish existences in its surroundings to increase its strength. Instead, it floated quietly in the middle of the grayish existences, and the attributes of time and space around its body were completely compatible with the attributes of time and space. The reason why it stopped was not that it couldn't support itself to continue cultivating, but because this world couldn't support it to continue to increase its strength. At this level, no matter how much grayish existences it absorbed, it could only increase its strength. It couldn't improve its essence at all, and it couldn't break through the boundary of the peak of the quasi-saint realm. It couldn't really step into the false sage realm, or even the sage realm. This was not the limitation of the creature itself, but the limitation of the world. At this moment, Luo Fan didn't notice anything special about this creature. All his attention was focused on the billions and trillions of subtle changes that he had received in the process of using the first level of the law of causality. Because the trillions and trillions of changes had become common sense, Luo Fan clearly knew that the shackles that had shackled him and prevented him from fully grasping the first level of the law of causality had completely disappeared. At this moment, he had perfectly grasped the first level of the law of causality that could only be mastered by those who had truly stepped into the false sage realm. At this moment, Luo Fan's heart jolted, and 9 invisible steps suddenly appeared in front of him. He was already standing in front of these steps, and the first step at the bottom seemed to be within his reach. He only needed to lift his foot, and he would be able to step on it. With this thought in mind, Luo Fan really lifted his foot and took a step forward. Originally, if he took this step in the past, the steps would definitely move forward with him. Even if he used the ability to shift through the void and directly cross billions of light years with a step, the steps would definitely move forward with him. But at this moment, after he completely comprehended the profundities of the first level of the law of karma, when he took a step forward, the stairs seemed to be bound by some inexplicable force and didn't move at all, allowing his foot to directly step on the first step. Seeing this, Luo Fan was overjoyed, and he exerted force with the foot that was stepping on the steps. As he exerted force, the 9 steps suddenly shook violently, as if they could not withstand his step at all and were about to collapse and disappear completely. At this moment, a mysterious space-time wave seeped out of Luo Fan's body and directly seeped into the steps, causing the steps that were about to collapse to finally stabilize and become as firm and stable as before. Luo Fan took this opportunity to raise his other foot and put it together with the foot that had stepped on the steps previously. However, he was already standing firmly on the steps. As he stood on the steps suddenly began to expand crazily in all directions, as if they had taken a great tonic. In the blink of an eye, the first step had already filled the entire world. Through the connection of space-time, it even spread to the entire demon realm, the entire Earth, the universe, and even the state of chaos, as well as all other worlds, all space-time, and all heaven and earth. After the steps underwent such a change, Luo Fan felt that his perception had undergone a qualitative change, and the range of the state of chaos that he could sense had suddenly expanded by more than 100 times. As for his magic power, his Tao fruit, his will, his thoughts, his mental strength, and so on and so forth, everything had suddenly increased by more than 100 times at this moment. This is the pseudo-sage. Luo Fan let out a long breath. He had an extremely satisfied expression on his face. At this moment, the first step had completely disappeared, or rather, it had completely fused with him. There were originally 9 steps in front of him, and there were only 8 steps left. The distance between him and the supreme, indestructible, eternally indestructible, indescribable existence on top of the stairs. It had become closer. All of this showed that at this moment, Luo Fan had really broken through the barrier between the pseudo-sage half-step and the real pseudo-sage, and had become a real pseudo-sage. I've finally succeeded. Without the help of magic treasures, it is indeed extremely difficult to become a pseudo-sage. Luo Fan slowly calmed down. An inexplicable smile appeared on his face. Although it did not take long for him to become a pseudo-sage from a pseudo-sage, and he did not seem to have gone through many hardships, he felt that it was a simple thing to become a pseudo-sage without the help of magic treasures. In fact, there were 3 fundamental reasons why Luo Fan could become a pseudo-sage so easily. First, when he was a pseudo-sage, he had comprehended the mystery of the first level of the law of cause and effect, and truly mastered the first level of the law of cause and effect that should have been mastered by pseudo-sage. Second, it was because he had comprehended the truth of time and space. From then on, he could change the flow of time and space without the help of any external forces, arrays, or anything else. He could change the speed of time and the attribute of space with his own will. And third, it was the most basic one. His body was in a flawless state, and both his body and mind were in an extremely perfect state. It was these 3 fundamental reasons that supported each other. It allowed him to break through the barrier between the pseudo-sage half-step and the pseudo-sage in such a short period of time without the help of any magic treasures, and set foot on the first step below the sage, becoming a pseudo-sage. The process of Luo Fan stepping on the steps reflected these three reasons. He was only one step away from the steps because of the third reason mentioned above. It was because he was in a perfect state that he could get so close to the steps, and he was closer to the pseudo-sage level than other pseudo-sage half-step. The reason why he could put his first foot on the first step was because of the first reason mentioned above. It was because he had mastered the first level of the law of cause and effect. The reason why the steps did not move back when he took a step forward was because the law of cause and effect fixed it. If Luo Fan had not mastered the first level of the law of cause and effect, it would have been impossible for him to put his first foot on the steps. Next, Luo Fan's other foot stepped on the steps, allowing his whole body to stand on the steps. The reason was obviously because of the second reason mentioned above. The reason why the steps did not collapse and disappear, but supported him firmly, was because he had injected his own power of time and space into the steps, which made the invisible steps stable and not collapse because of his existence. Luo Fan thought about it for a moment and understood the mystery of the whole process. Waves of understanding surged in his heart. To step on the steps, he needed three kinds of support. Perhaps it was not necessarily the three kinds of support that Luo Fan could use to step on the steps, but there must be three kinds of support for a cultivator to really step on the steps and become a pseudo-sage. Ordinary cultivators could only use magic treasures to step on the steps, which meant they had to combine the three kinds of support into one or two. As for the remaining two or one kind of support, it was completely provided by the magic treasure. This was very obvious. Ordinary cultivators who wanted to be qualified to break through to the pseudo-sage level would first need to become a pseudo-sage cultivator. In order to become a pseudo-sage cultivator, they would need some kind of support to get close to the 9 steps. This required them to have at least one of the three kinds of support. When using magic treasures to become a pseudo-sage cultivator, the magic treasure would of course need to be upgraded from the pseudo-sage level to the pseudo-sage level. The mysteries contained in the process of ascension definitely contained some sort of unfathomable profundity, and it contained all sorts of mysteries of the pseudo-saint stage. Among them, there must be some power that only pseudo-sage cultivators had. This was for sure, and the power that only pseudo-sage cultivators could be used as a city for a pseudo-sage cultivator to break through and become a true pseudo-sage cultivator. The amount of support that a pseudo-sage magic treasure could provide to a cultivator represented the amount of power or ability that the pseudo-sage magic treasure possessed. This was the reason why a pseudo-sage magic treasure could help a pseudo-sage cultivator break through the limit and truly step on the 9 steps. Chapter 1270. After knowing all this, Luo Fan also understood why other half-step pseudo-sage powerhouses couldn't become pseudo-sage powerhouses by relying on their own comprehension. For ordinary cultivators, being able to comprehend the power of a certain pseudo-sage divine ability and obtain one of the 3 necessary supports was already a great opportunity. Almost 1 out of 100,000 people would have such an opportunity. To obtain the second support was thousands or even tens of thousands of times more difficult than obtaining the first support. The difficulty of obtaining the third pillar was thousands or even tens of thousands of times more difficult than obtaining the second pillar. In this way, it might take hundreds of thousands of peak quasi-sages to obtain the first support and become a half-step pseudo-sage powerhouse. Although the probability was extremely small, it was still possible. Therefore, in the vast demon realm and the boundless earth universe, because there were too many cultivators, such half-step pseudo-sage powerhouses were actually not rare. According to the probability of obtaining the second support, it might take tens of millions or even hundreds of millions of half-step pseudo-sage powerhouses to obtain the second support and set 1 foot on the 9th step. Even with the huge number of cultivators in the demon realm and the earth universe, the probability was too small. It was so small that it was difficult to pin one's hopes on it. If one really did not rely on external forces and relied on their own comprehension, The number of cultivators in the entire demon realm and the Earth universe who could set 1 foot on the 9th step would probably not exceed 3 digits. Even the probability of obtaining the second support, a cultivator with 1 foot on the 9th step, was so small. If one wanted to obtain the third support and set both feet on the 9th step, the probability of truly becoming a pseudo-sage powerhouse would obviously be even smaller. In fact, it could even be said that it was almost impossible. From the above, it could be seen that if one wanted to obtain the 3 necessary supports to set foot on the 9th step without the help of external forces and become a true pseudo-sage powerhouse. In this Earth universe, there probably wouldn't be any pseudo-sage powerhouses like level 1 or level 2 pseudo-sage powerhouses born since ancient times. No wonder they have to use magic treasures to become a pseudo-sage powerhouse. Luo Fan sighed. He completely understood why the Supreme Sage created a method to become a pseudo-sage powerhouse with the help of magic treasures. This at the same time, he also understood what the path to sainthood in the great Tianyuan world was for. The path to sainthood probably existed to allow cultivators to set foot on the 9 steps. There were many mysteries contained within it. It was most likely to allow cultivators to rely on themselves to comprehend the wondrous effects of the 3 types of support. He even had a vague idea of what the path to becoming a saint in the great Tianyuan world would look like. However, all of this was meaningless to him. After thinking for a while, he put these thoughts aside and had an idea. He didn't care what the many worlds were like in this endless haze, and he didn't care what the creature he created was doing. He directly released his senses and broke through the barriers of this world, completely immersing himself in the boundless outside. Time, space, matter, energy, and everything else was in an indescribable state of chaos. After his previous experience, he had a better understanding of the truth of this chaotic state. He vaguely felt that what he saw was not the truth of this chaotic state. However, this did not allow him to comprehend the truth immediately, nor did it allow him to comprehend the mysteries of the state of chaos in an instant. It was even more impossible for him to obtain the ability to travel freely in the state of chaos in an instant. If he wanted to understand the mysteries of the chaotic state, he could only comprehend it bit by bit, just like in the past. He had to comprehend it bit by bit. However, he already had a better understanding of the truth of the chaotic state. As he continued to comprehend it, there were many changes compared to the normal state. It seemed that the chaotic state was no longer as chaotic as before, and he gradually sensed an inexplicable pattern within it. Of course, this kind of pattern was extremely obscure, complicated, and mysterious. The degree of its mysteries. It was even to the extent that compared to it, even the great Tao of the perfect world was as simple as 1 + 1. Even though Luo Fan could vaguely sense the inexplicable pattern, he felt as if he was touching upon an existence that was more profound and unfathomable than the way of the sage. He could not understand it at all, let alone analyze its mysteries. Of course, although he could not understand it or analyze it, he had already sensed it. Compared to before, it had already risen by a huge level. Looking down from this level, the countless changes in the chaotic state that he could not understand before seemed to have become traceable. With a slight jolt of his heart, countless pieces of information surged out from the chaotic state and poured into his heart, making him seem to understand many inconceivable things in a daze. However, if he were to say these things that he understood, he would not know where to start, and he would not be able to express them in any way. However, because of such changes, his entire body began to produce inexplicable fluctuations. The fluctuations were born from the depths of his body, then rushed out of his body and stopped several feet away from his body. They directly opened up a strange space-time in which billions of inexplicable things evolved. The space-time directly went through countless mysterious changes, making the billions of inexplicable things even more incredible and inexplicable. Then, the fluctuations retracted back into his body, completely shrinking to the point where they were born. After a short while, another cycle was born and another fluctuation was born, once again spreading out from that point, sweeping through his body, and finally rushing out of his body, forming a strange space-time around his body, evolving into countless mysterious things and phenomena. After a while, they retracted again. Just like that, the cycle continued to appear around Luo Fan's body. And after each cycle, an extremely subtle change would happen to Luo Fan's body. The feeling of being flawless and unhindered was constantly increasing. And in this feeling of being flawless and unhindered, there was a faint feeling of being independent of space-time. It was as if he had gradually become a space-time independent of the outside world. He had become an absolutely independent existence. At the same time, there was a lingering charm of controlling cause and effect. This lingering charm of controlling cause and effect was as if all cause and effect had reached his body, becoming a real existence. It was as if he could control and use it at will. This process lasted for an unknown period of time. This unknown period of time was not caused by the confusion of his own perception of time in the past. Instead, it was caused by the unpredictable changes in Luo Fan's own time. He had no connection with the outside world at all, and there was no mutual influence between them. In fact, for the outside world, this period of time was only a short period of dozens of breaths. And for Luo Fan, even he did not know how long this period of time was. The rapid change of time made him unable to control exactly how much time had passed. However, this no longer held any meaning for him. Ever since he could control his own time at will, ever since he could speed up or slow down his own time with just a thought, the passage of time in the outside world was no longer meaningful to him. In other words, from that moment onwards, he could be said to have transcended the boundaries of space-time. After an unknown period of time, Luo Fan slowly opened his eyes, and the fluctuation cycle that constantly appeared on his body slowly subsided. As for his cultivation realm, at this time, he had already perfectly stabilized at the level of level 1 pseudo-sage. Moreover, he was flawless and independent of space-time and could perfectly use the first level of the law of causality. With a slight thought, he lifted his foot and took a light step forward, and an independent incarnation walked out of his body. This incarnation had almost all the characteristics that belonged to him, be it flawless or unhindered, or independent of space-time, or controlling causality. Of course, it was just an incarnation after all. Although its realm was already at the level of level 1 pseudo-sage, the power it possessed was still far from Luo Fan's. It was only equivalent to a half-step pseudo-sage. However, for an existence at Luo Fan's level, his body could already produce vitality out of thin air to replenish his power. The difference in power levels was meaningless at all. He saw, after the incarnation appeared, its body shook and the power aura on its body began to gradually increase. Moreover, the speed of its growth was so fast that it was beyond the imagination of all living beings. In just a few short breaths, it directly broke through the limit of a half-step pseudo-sage and directly stepped into the true pseudo-sage level. That level of power was more than 1,000 times stronger than when it was first born. After its power was completely replenished, this incarnation looked even more mysterious, profound, and mysterious than Luo Fan. Because of its flawlessness, any other living being would naturally give birth to a characteristic that belonged to Luo Fan. At this time, it was displayed without any concealment at all. This characteristic made the incarnation, which was suspended in a gray existence, look like a god standing in the middle of chaos. It had an absolute majesty and absolute shock. This incarnation was also Luo Fan, so it was naturally under his control. Therefore, after he appeared, he didn't need Luo Fan's instructions at all, and he didn't even look at Luo Fan. He directly lifted his foot and stepped into the gap between heaven and earth and the state of chaos. Both the realm and the level of power of this incarnation had set foot on the first step of the pseudo-sage realm. Compared to when it was in the Tao integration realm and the Tao master realm, it was many times easier in this gray existence. Because of the mutual influence between the state of chaos and heaven and earth, This gray space had both some characteristics of heaven and earth and some characteristics of the state of chaos. The chaos of time and space was one of the most prominent characteristics. Ordinary cultivators, even those who had already reached the pseudo-sage realm, or the level 8 or level 9, would certainly find it difficult to see what the surroundings were like after stepping into this space. It was difficult to know where they were, and it was even more difficult to know how long had passed. Even if they used their spiritual force to break the state and leave this gray space, they might not be able to find the way back to this space. However, for Luo Fan, who is only at the level 1 pseudo-sage realm at this moment, the gap between heaven and earth and the state of chaos was extremely clear. Moreover, for the first time, he saw the edge of this space and touched the boundary between this space and the state of chaos. It was a thin film. It was a thin film that he could touch no matter where he was in the gap. Sure enough, Luo Fan's incarnation looked at this thin film with a faint smile on his face. Looking back, he saw that behind him, there's also a thin film that he could touch with his hand. This thin film, it was the boundary between this space and the Earth universe, or the world that simulated the state of chaos. As long as he broke through this thin film, he would be able to return to that world. These two thin films were boundless, and no matter which direction he looked in, he could not see the end of them at all. Being sandwiched between these two thin films, there was naturally an indescribable feeling of suffocation. There was even an illusion that these two thin films were closing and were about to completely crush him into powder. With a thought, Luo Fan lifted his foot and took a light step. When he took this step, he was supposed to directly step onto the gray membrane in front of him. However, nothing happened when he took this step. He easily took a step forward. The thin film was still in front of him, still within reach. When he turned around, he saw that the boundary between the gap and the Earth's universe was also within reach behind him. This phenomenon looked like the two thin films were moving synchronously with his movements. Although Luo Fan had expected this, his expression still changed slightly. But when he really saw it, his expression changed slightly. After thinking for a while, he locked on to the thin film, raised his hand, and stretched it forward. With this stretch, his right hand seemed to penetrate countless layers of space-time, and in an instant, with the help of the changes in the law of causality, an unknown number of trillions of changes occurred. In the end, finally, he came into contact with a strange barrier. This barrier was incomparably thick and sturdy. It was pressed down slightly. It was as if he was pressing on a water surface with infinite tension. No matter how hard he pressed, he could not press it in. Luo Fan was secretly amazed. He looked at the thin film in front of him, but if he wanted to touch it, he would need to penetrate endless space-time and even use the law of causality. With a thought, he suddenly gathered all his strength and blasted it at the thin film. If this attack of his was in an ordinary world, even if it was a world that completely simulated a state of chaos, it would be able to instantly destroy the entire world, turning everything that existed in that world into nothingness. However, after this attack hit the thin film, it still did not affect it at all. It could not even sink into the seemingly extremely flexible thin film. By the time Luo Fan retracted his hand, the thin film did not even shake a little. It was as if Luo Fan's attack, which could destroy any vast thousand worlds, did not exist at all. This situation made Luo Fan's all-out attack seem like an ant trying to shake a tree, and Luo Fan could not help but smile bitterly. As expected, a world's barrier cannot be broken so easily. Fortunately, this barrier did not counterattack. Otherwise, I'm afraid I would have been shattered by this counterattack, he thought to himself. He stopped probing and locked onto the thin film, then lifted his foot and stepped out. With this step, the light and shadows around his body changed wildly, and there seemed to be an endless amount of time and space flashing by. The trillions and trillions of things he had comprehended in using the law of causality were completely different from what he had seen in the past. However, they were equally complicated, mysterious, and unbelievable changes occurred at the same time. Through various channels, they directly affected his body, And finally, he seemed to have penetrated through all kinds of invisible barriers and arrived at an extremely mysterious place. The place where the thin membrane was. It was not in front of the thin film, where he could touch it with his hand. Instead, his entire body had sunk into the thin film. The thin film was like an eternally unmoving object to his touch and attack. There were no changes at all, and there were no consequences at all. However, to him, who had personally come here, it was not as terrifyingly tough and heavy as before. It did not obstruct him at all, and at this moment, half of his body had sunk into the thin film. Seeing this, Luo Fan was overjoyed. Without any hesitation, he exerted his strength and took a step forward. With a pop, his entire body passed through the thin film. After he passed through the thin film, it was as if nothing had happened. There wasn't even a tremor, let alone a hole or anything like that. The thin film was the boundary between the gap and the state of chaos. Of course, there was only one possibility after passing through the thin film, and that was the state of chaos. Chapter 1271. The moment the incarnation passed through the thin film and entered the state of chaos, Luo Fan, who was in the gray world, instantly felt that the strong connection between him and the incarnation, which could replace each other, was completely cut off in an instant. It felt as if the incarnation was no longer his incarnation, but had become a completely independent existence. This feeling made Luo Fan's expression change slightly, and he instantly understood that his previous thoughts were completely in vain. It's actually completely cut off. In this case, unless the incarnation can re-enter this world with its own power, it's impossible to know what the incarnation has comprehended in the state of chaos. Luo Fan sighed, but he did not hesitate to rush into the state of chaos and search for the existence of his incarnation within the range of the state of chaos that he could sense. Although Luo Fan could already sense the state of chaos a long time ago, the state of chaos was vast and boundless. Any point of it could open up a vast and perfect world like the Earth universe. Given that Luo Fan was only a level 1 pseudo-sage, the range of the state of chaos that he could sense was quite limited. In fact, it could even be said to be extremely insignificant. Given the state of chaos that he could sense, he did not have much confidence that he could find the existence of his incarnation. However, Luo Fan was obviously quite lucky. At the edge of the state of chaos that he could sense, he saw the existence of his incarnation. That incarnation had a part of Luo Fan's will. Its thoughts, its power, and everything about it were the same as Luo Fan's. After the connection with Luo Fan was cut off, it began to work hard to return to the Earth universe, to re-enter the world, and to reconnect with Luo Fan. And when Luo Fan's perception swept over this location, this incarnation was bursting out with its infinite magical powers, trying its best to drill back. Unfortunately, the power of the state of chaos. It was really terrifying. Even though Luo Fan was a level 1 pseudo-sage, and he was many times stronger than ordinary level 1 pseudo-sages, and even level 4 or 5 pseudo-sages might not be able to compare to him in the face of the chaotic state. It was still as fragile as an egg. No matter what kind of divine power Luo Fan unleashed. What kind of power was that? Even if he displayed the first level of the law of causality, even if he displayed his own independent space-time, even if he perfectly stimulated his unique worldview, with just a slight fluctuation in the chaotic state, all the attacks were completely dissolved. And after this chaotic state melted away many of his divine abilities and powers, just a little bit of the aftermath swept across his body, and the entire body of the incarnation completely melted away. In the end, Luo Fan only saw the last shadow of the incarnation the moment it disappeared. Luo Fan's expression changed when he saw the incarnation disappear so easily. It's actually so fragile. I'm still far from it. Luo Fan's expression became extremely solemn. Everything that the incarnation had was the same as his main body, be it strength, physical strength, or cultivation. There was no difference at all. The incarnation could only last in the chaotic state for a short period of time that was difficult to describe accurately. This meant that the time that Luo Fan could last in the chaotic state would not be any longer than that. This was a huge blow to Luo Fan, who was originally full of confidence and thought that he had made great progress and should be able to last in the chaotic state for a long time. However, this was also normal. Normally, if one wanted to survive freely in the chaotic state, one had to raise one's cultivation realm to the sage realm. A level 9 pseudo-sage existence was still hundreds of millions of times weaker than a sage. Even existences at their level could only last for an extremely short period of time after entering the chaotic state. It was impossible for them to last for a long time. Not to mention a sage, Luo Fan was tens of thousands of times weaker than a level 9 pseudo-sage. It was easy to imagine how long he could last in that state of chaos. After sorting out his emotions, Luo Fan sighed to himself. The solemn expression on his face gradually calmed down, and there was a thoughtful look in his eyes. Although what he saw just now was only the last moment when his incarnation was completely erased in the chaotic state, the many changes that happened in that instant had already broadened his horizons. He felt as if the layers of fog in his eyes had been completely lifted. This incarnation was a complete copy of Luo Fan's main body. All the magical powers he possessed, the various methods he displayed, everything he possessed belonged to Luo Fan. The chaotic state contained endless mysteries and endless, unbelievable principles. The fluctuation caused by Luo Fan's incarnation was naturally produced completely against everything that Luo Fan had. In other words, the fluctuation that was produced in the chaotic state at that moment was the most targeted attack against Luo Fan in the infinite perfect world. This kind of attack, even the attack of a sage, could not be so targeted. It was impossible for it to perfectly target Luo Fan. Under such circumstances, it was obvious that Luo Fan only needed to fully comprehend the fluctuations generated at this moment. Then, he would naturally be able to know where his own weakness was, but he didn't know where it was. Clearly, as long as he found the weakness with Luo Fan's cultivation realm, it would be a simple matter for him to find a way to deal with it. Therefore, it could be said that the incarnation was so easily erased. Although this was a tragic thing, it was like fishing. From the endless mysteries in the chaotic state, it fished out the mysteries that were absolutely targeted against Luo Fan. This was obviously a rather good way to comprehend the mysteries of the chaotic state. Even, according to this method, Luo Fan had even roughly drawn up a special cultivation method, which could even be said to be the method to become a sage. That method was none other than to constantly send the incarnation into the chaotic state, provoking the chaotic state to evolve specifically against his incarnation. Thus, he could comprehend the many changes that happened in that instant when his incarnation was completely erased, and use it to improve the existence of his own body, making up for the weaknesses that were targeted by the chaotic state. When he had roughly made up for those weaknesses, he would send another incarnation into the chaotic state, once again provoking the chaotic state to react. Then he would comprehend again, and this cycle would repeat. Compared to the chaotic state, unless a cultivator was a saint-level existence, it was impossible to be perfect. This sentence could be understood the other way around. That was, once a cultivator was perfect compared to the chaotic state, then he would be a sage. Therefore, before Luo Fan became a sage, this method of constantly using the chaotic state to look for weaknesses. The process of making up for weaknesses was almost endless. But on the other hand, if Luo Fan could send his incarnation into the chaotic state, and could make it so that the chaotic state could no longer trigger fluctuations that targeted his weaknesses, it meant that he had already achieved the sage realm and achieved the mixed yuan Dao fruit. It was precisely because of this that Luo Fan dared to think of this cultivation method as the method to become a sage. This was not his unrealistic ambition, but the conclusion that he came to after careful consideration. Of course, in theory, this method could support him to become a sage, but to rely on this method to become a sage, one could imagine how difficult it would be. This was just like any cultivation method passed down by a sage. Didn't it also say that one could become a sage at the end of the cultivation? But how many cultivators could really become a sage by relying on the cultivation method passed down by a sage? It could be said that the future of this cultivation method was extremely bright. However, it was a pity that the path was extremely tortuous. Luo Fan had fully anticipated the difficulty of this cultivation method, but did not prevent him from feeling relaxed. No matter how difficult it was after all a visible method to become a sage, and it seemed to be such a clear path. He only needed to constantly send his incarnations into the chaotic state and comprehend the changes that were stirred up. Although the number of incarnations sent out might reach an unimaginably terrifying level, compared to other illusory methods to become a sage, this was obviously many times better. Why would he be dissatisfied? At this moment, an inexplicable feeling suddenly swept through Luo Fan's body. In a trance, he felt that the entire Earth, the universe, the entire demon realm, and even every location in the unknown variety of strange worlds in between were experiencing countless extremely subtle and inexplicable changes in an instant. The scope of these changes was so vast that even if the changes caused by them were extremely sparse, the total amount reached an unimaginable level. Compared to this terrifying amount, it was almost like the difference between an ant and the entire Earth, or even the entire universe. This terrifying amount of changes that could not even be described with numbers ultimately pointed to one goal, and that was the traces left behind by Luo Fan's incarnations in the universe files. At this moment, Luo Fan suddenly felt as if his memory of the incarnations was gradually disappearing. Feeling this change, Luo Fan instantly understood what he had forgotten. The existence that was erased by the state of chaos was the entire process of all existences in all time and space being completely erased. In other words, once any living being was erased by the state of chaos, then all the traces left in the world and all the memories left in the hearts of all living beings would be completely erased at the same time, making it seem as if there had never been such a living being in the universe. No one would ever remember that such a living being once existed in the universe, even if it was someone close to the living being. This was what was happening at this moment. The time that Luo Fan's incarnation appeared in this universe was extremely short, and he did not even see any living being at all. There were not many traces left in this universe. The only one who had memories of this incarnation might be Luo Fan himself. Under such circumstances, the mechanism that completely erased all traces left by the incarnation would, of course, only affect Luo Fan's memories. Feeling that his memory of the incarnation was gradually becoming blurry, Luo Fan felt extremely indignant. Back then, when he was still in the Khanate Zenith Heaven realm during the Dharma Ending Age, he had once entered the state of chaos with another Khanate Zenith Heaven realm cultivator through a loophole in the Earth's universe, and watched another cultivator create the world. At this moment, that kind of behavior back then was obviously arrogant to the point of being laughably arrogant. The outcome of the creation of the world was almost certain. The cultivator's entire body was directly erased by the state of chaos because of the change. If Luo Fan had not used the connection between himself and the main body of the primordial world to transfer his memory with the help of the barrier between the two perfect worlds, he might have forgotten the existence of that cultivator. However, although what he did back then was a good idea, seriously speaking, Luo Fan could indeed use the same method to avoid the memory erasure of the state of chaos. However, Luo Fan did not want to make such a choice. The time dimension of the Earth's universe was different from the time dimension of the primordial world. Although Luo Fan could use the connection between the clone and the main body to communicate between the two perfect worlds, he sent the memory over now. When a main body sent the memory back, tens of millions of years or even hundreds of millions of years would have passed. Luo Fan could still wait once or twice, but if he wanted to send his incarnation into the state of chaos to stir up the changes in the state of chaos to cultivate, the number of times he needed might even be calculated in the billions. How could he wait like this every time? Perhaps after a few more times, the great tribulation of the Earth's universe would descend. The entire Earth's universe would be destroyed. It was because of this consideration that Luo Fan felt so indignant at this moment. If he did not solve this problem, the method he had just thought of to become a saint would be useless. It would just be a flower in the fog and the moon in the water. It would be nothing. I have to think of a way. Luo Fan's thoughts started to move crazily. Countless ideas quickly flashed through his mind. Countless methods continuously emerged, and then continuously disappeared. However, how could it be so easy to think of a way to resist the erasure of the existence of living beings in the state of chaos? How could it be so easy to find a way to counteract such erasure? Luo Fan thought of countless ways, but in the end, he realized that none of them worked. Although Luo Fan's thinking speed was fast, the countless changes that exceeded the limit of numbers also had an effect on him. In the process of constantly rejecting the ideas that emerged in his mind, his memories of his incarnation began to melt like snowflakes meeting the sun. Soon, he felt that only a tiny trace of his memories of his incarnation was left. He vaguely remembered that he had created an incarnation, but he forgot what he had created it for. At this moment, Luo Fan's eyes lit up, and he could not help but smile inexplicably. This is the application of the law of causality. With a flash of inspiration, he suddenly understood what was going on. What kind of process was it that the infinite changes that were happening in the entire Earth, the entire demon realm, and even the countless worlds in between were gathering in one place to completely erase all traces of his incarnation's existence? This was clearly one of the three major pillars that he had comprehended after tens of thousands of years of comprehension. It was an application of the law of causality. When he understood this, Luo Fan roared. His body trembled as he directly used the first level of the law of causality. He raised his hand and slapped his head. He directly defined this slap as the cause, and then defined the result of this slap to be that he would never forget his incarnation and everything that had happened to it. As he slapped his head, countless trillions of changes appeared in this world. This strange world that seemed to be in a state of chaos appeared everywhere. These countless changes ultimately pointed to the same goal, Luo Fan. And their goal was none other than to constantly strengthen Luo Fan's memories of his incarnation. The effects of these trillions of changes superimposed with the effects of the endless changes caused by the state of chaos, the entire Earth, the universe, the realm of demons, and other endless worlds. After canceling each other out, these trillions of changes actually gained the upper hand. This caused all of Luo Fan's memories of his incarnation to instantly recover at the same time, including what the incarnation had encountered after entering the state of chaos. And even the entire process of how the state of chaos produced waves to completely erase his incarnation. Everything became extremely clear, and there was an unforgettable feeling mixed in it. The reason for this was not that Luo Fan's ability was stronger than the state of chaos, which was obviously impossible. If he was really that strong, he would have become a saint long ago. The reason for this was that Luo Fan's own ability and the essence of his existence were really too weak compared to the state of chaos. It was precisely because the essence of his existence was too weak that the changes in the law of causality caused by the existence traces of his incarnation in the state of chaos were also extremely weak. At the very least, compared to the power that the state of chaos possessed, it was so weak that the effects of Luo Fan's usage of the first level of the law of causality were able to offset the effects of the endless changes caused by the state of chaos. Chapter 1272. Sensing that everything about his incarnation and his memory was rapidly recovering, Luo Fan finally relaxed completely. Looks like I can't put all my hopes on this cultivation method. I have to strengthen my control over the law of causality at the same time. Otherwise, I'm afraid that one day the chaotic state will change irresistibly due to the incarnation, and I'll completely forget everything about the incarnation. Luo Fan thought to himself. Although he had used the first level of the law of causality to resist the erasure of the existence of his incarnation, it did not mean that he could still use this method to resist the erasure in the future. It was conceivable that the erasure of the existence of his incarnation in the chaotic state was based on the size of the incarnation he had thrown into the chaotic state. Since this was the case, it was obvious that the more powerful the incarnation he threw into the chaotic state, the more intense the chaotic state's reaction would be. The erasure power would obviously be more terrifying. If his control over the law of causality had not reached a certain level and could not offset the erasure power, then it was almost certain that his memories of his incarnation would be erased. Luo Fan threw his incarnation into the state of primal chaos, not to see how the state of primal chaos would erase his incarnation, nor to see how his incarnation would die. Instead, it was to strengthen his own cultivation realm, so that he could eventually become a sage. Since this was the case, it was obvious that the incarnation that Luo Fan threw into the chaotic state over time would only become stronger and stronger. It could only become more and more powerful. Because of that, the ripples of the primal chaos would also become more and more intense. And the power of the chaotic state's erasure of his memories would naturally become more and more terrifying. If this cycle continued, if Luo Fan didn't work hard to strengthen his control over the law of causality and didn't deepen his level of application of the law of causality, then after a few times, that chaotic state would produce the power to erase traces of existence. It would exceed his tolerance limit, and he would immediately forget about his incarnation after throwing it into the chaotic state. It was because of this consideration that Luo Fan had such an idea at this time. After making up his mind, Luo Fan stopped thinking about it and began to recall that moment just now. It was the kind of weak fluctuation that was produced when his incarnation was erased in the state of chaos. To ordinary living beings, the fluctuation might be like a slight wave, but to an existence like Luo Fan, it was a combination of endless profundities. Every tiny change contained the truth that could allow any cultivator to surpass their limits and reach supreme realms. For an existence like Luo Fan, he only needed to see something once. He would never forget it. The minute fluctuations that were produced in that instant were also the kind of existence that he would never forget after a single glance. Therefore, at this moment, although he was only recalling it, it was as if he was there himself. He clearly remembered every detail of the ripples and felt every tiny bit of power produced by the ripples. Even though the fluctuation was extremely faint, it was still a fluctuation produced in a chaotic state after all. Its complexity and unpredictability could not be described with words. If the fluctuation had been something else, for Luo Fan, comprehending the profundities contained in the chaotic state at all times was as difficult as comprehending the profundities of the chaotic state. It could be said to be almost impossible. However, this fluctuation was not an ordinary fluctuation. It was a fluctuation that was completely targeted at Luo Fan. It was a fluctuation that was absolutely targeted at him. In order to comprehend the fluctuation, Luo Fan only needed to start from himself. He needed to start from his various powers, characteristics, and natures. Then, he would naturally be able to find some breakthrough points and continuously comprehend the profundities within. This method was so obvious that there was no secret to Luo Fan at all. Therefore, very soon, he found a way and began to immerse himself in the endless principles and profundities. Almost at every moment, he felt that he had a deeper understanding of himself. He could even faintly feel that his cultivation realm was progressing slowly, but it was extremely steady. Currently, Luo Fan could already have his own independent space-time in this world. Therefore, although the process of comprehending the instantaneous fluctuation would take an extremely long time, it was very obvious that this method was very obvious to Luo Fan. However, when he clearly comprehended the profundities of the fluctuation this time, he could faintly feel that his cultivation realm had improved a lot. He felt that he had become more complete, more harmonious, and his mind was more clear. However, Only a short day had passed in the outside world. Such a short day, which was the time that had passed in this murky world that seemed to be in a chaotic state, was only 100,000th of a day to the earth or the demon realm in the outside world, or even less than a second. This was because this independent space-time characteristic was only a characteristic that Luo Fan possessed. Therefore, during this period of time, although he himself had already gone through hundreds of thousands of years, the magic treasures and items that he possessed had only passed through a day. Among them, this included the Space Maiden who was organizing her worldview in the Creation Shrine, as well as the Creation Shrine itself. But there was no way around it. Using one's own independent time and space to influence other beings and objects was more difficult than attaining that attribute himself. It was essentially the same as helping others in their cultivation, allowing others to attain his current level of attainment, and the difficulty of it was imaginable. In fact, according to Luo Fan's calculations, it might require an omnipotent saint to be able to achieve this. Feeling that his cultivation realm had improved by quite a bit, Luo Fan smiled. With a thought, another clone appeared outside of his body. This clone was the same as the previous one. Its cultivation realm was also the same as his, but its power was far from his. After this clone appeared, it began to close its eyes, and the power within its body was born out of thin air. It continuously increased the level of its power, pushing it towards the same direction as its main body. This time, because Luo Fan's cultivation realm had improved by quite a bit, the time it took was slightly longer than the previous time. Only then did this clone completely reach the same level as his main body. This allowed his clone to be exactly the same as his main body, no matter how one looked at it. Billions of clones. This was the power that powerful cultivators possessed. Even if it was an itinerant immortal who had just achieved immortal Tao, if they wanted to create a clone or clone, they only needed to spend some materials and some power. They could create it. Not to mention that it was an existence like Luo Fan, who was countless trillions of times stronger than those itinerant immortals. For him, he could create an endless number of clones with a single thought. Moreover, because he was no longer self-sufficient, he could even generate power out of thin air. Therefore, every incarnation that he created would cause him great damage. Therefore, he could completely replenish the clones the moment they were formed. Therefore, sending clones to their deaths would not cause any harm to Luo Fan. Because of this, he would never get tired of it. In fact, Luo Fan was not the only one who had this ability. However, for ordinary cultivators, no matter what, the clones created would be weaker than the cultivator himself. In a battle between cultivators, the weaker clones would be useless even if there were an infinite number of them. They would not affect the outcome of the battle at all. It was precisely because of this that it was almost impossible for ordinary cultivators to create clones to help them in battle. For them, unless there were too many things to do and they needed a few more clones to do. Otherwise, no cultivator would purposely create a clone. Although the avatar that Luo Fan had created was almost the same as his body, it wasn't very useful in battle. After all, if this clone could do it, his main body could already do it. However, his main body cannot do it. Even if the clone was added, it would be useless. In this way, the clone would be useless in battle. There was not much use to speak of. This was completely different from the situation where he had the power of two of himself. After all, in a situation where he had the power of two of himself, his power could be interchanged and superimposed without any gaps. It was almost equivalent to raising his own power level. Compared to an incarnation with the same power level, he was naturally much stronger. After the clone was condensed, it was expressionless and did not have any intention of talking to Luo Fan. With a step, it directly entered the gap between heaven and earth and the state of chaos, triggering countless subtle and mysterious changes. Its entire body crashed into the thin membrane that acted as the boundary between the state of chaos and the gap. It directly broke through heaven and earth, broke through the universe, and entered the state of chaos. At this moment, Luo Fan's main body also spread out his perception and locked onto the place where he had discovered the clone in the state of chaos. He also saw the entire process of the clone being erased from the state of chaos. Although Luo Fan felt that his cultivation realm and strength had made great progress, and he was several times, or even more than 10 times stronger than when he had just become a pseudo-sage, he also saw the entire process of the clone being erased. However, after the clone that was almost identical to his main body entered the primal chaos state, what happened was exactly the same as what happened to his clone before he ascended. The primal chaos state also produced an extremely weak wave that disintegrated the many defensive and offensive abilities that he had used all of his strength and methods to cast. Then, without wasting any time, it acted on his clone and completely erased his clone. The entire process was unimaginably smooth. In a trance, Luo Fan felt like he was looking at an ant facing the boundless ocean. No matter how much strength it used to attack the ocean, it could not change the fact that any tiny wave could push it back. However, Luo Fan did not have the time to feel emotional, because at this moment, the inexplicable wave produced by the state of chaos completely erased his clone. Endless subtle changes appeared in the entire Earth, the entire universe, the entire demon realm, and countless worlds in between. In the end, all the changes hit one target, Luo Fan. A feeling of memory being erased arose spontaneously. At this moment, Luo Fan, who was already prepared, raised his hand and patted his head. With a light pa sound, the entire gray world suddenly produced billions of tiny changes that seemed to be unrelated. All the changes were concentrated on Luo Fan's body in an indescribable way. They collided with the power of memory, erasing produced by the state of chaos. At that moment, Luo Fan felt that his memory was disappearing rapidly, and at the same time, it was being quickly replenished by another strange power. This power of erasure and replenishment was like a seesaw. Suddenly, one side had the upper hand. Suddenly, the other side had the upper hand. In Luo Fan's senses, this process lasted for several years or even decades. The power of the first level of the law of causality that he displayed finally gained the upper hand. It completely shattered the power of the state of chaos erasure, allowing him to finally retain all the memories of that clone. He completely retained the moment of memory. Luo Fan could not help but show a look of lingering fear on his face. Just a little bit more, he thought in his heart, and the expression on his face became even more unsightly. Just now, he was just a little bit more, and his memory of that clone would have been completely erased by the power of the state of chaos. If that happened, he would have completely forgotten that he had just thrown that clone into the state of chaos. He might even have thought that he was just preparing to throw his clone into the state of chaos, so that he could condense another clone, throw his clone into the state of chaos, and then suffer another erasure of the power of the state of chaos. He would then forget about the clone and throw it again, and so on, forming an endless cycle. Thinking of this, Luo Fan could not help but shiver. If that was the case, even he would feel a little terrified. The gap just now was really too small. If it wasn't for the slight eruption of the power of the law of causality at the last moment, perhaps my memory of the clone would have already been erased. Suddenly, Luo Fan felt a chill in his heart. He thought to himself, this kind of thing, there are almost two possible outcomes, and the probability of it happening is 50-50. It's not surprising that the power of the first level of the law of causality suppressed the power of memory erasure. And it's also natural that the power of memory erasure suppressed the power of the first level of the law of causality. This time, was my luck really so good that I just happened to suppress the power of memory erasure? Or is this the result of countless confrontations, the inevitable outcome of suppressing the power of memory erasure? Thinking of this, a bitter expression appeared on Luo Fan's face. If it was the first outcome, it meant that his luck was heaven-defying. This time, when he sent his clone into the state of chaos for the first time, he remembered all the changes caused by the erasure of the clone. If it was the second outcome, it obviously meant that he had sent his clone into the state of chaos many times before to be erased by the state of chaos. It was just that every time his memory of the clone would be erased by the state of chaos, causing him to think that he hadn't sent his clone over yet. So he sent his clone out again, and so on. Only after an unknown number of his clones had been erased did he counteract the power of memory erasure and remember the entire process of sending his clone into the state of chaos this time. As for what the result would be, it was impossible for Luo Fan to know it all. The state of chaos erased traces of the existence of the clone, and the biggest impact on Luo Fan was the memory erasure. However, this did not mean that the erasure was only aimed at memory. In fact, this erasure was aimed at all the effects of the clone's existence. This included the traces left by the clone in any world, any space-time, any heaven and earth, and even the influence of the clone's existence on time, space, all energy, and all matter. After everything was erased, no living being would be able to find out about the existence of the incarnation through indirect means, unless they could remember the existence of the incarnation. In order to know about something indirectly, one would have to deduce it through the influence it had on other things and the traces it left behind. Since that was the case, after all traces and influences were completely erased, it was naturally impossible to know the existence of the clone through any means. Faced with such a problem that he had no way of knowing the truth, Luo Fan could only shake his head in the end and console himself that this matter would not affect him at all. There was no need to think about it at all. The effect of this consolation was, of course, very mediocre. After all, when he thought about how he might have sent his clone into the state of chaos in a daze, and then immediately forgot about it, then sent the clone again, forgot about it, and sent it again, and so on for hundreds, thousands, tens of thousands of times, he felt an inexplicable chill down his spine. There's no need to think too much. The most important thing now is to improve my cultivation realm. As long as I can continue to improve, this fate will not happen to me. Luo Fan thought for a while and finally managed to gather his thoughts. With his outstanding willpower, he forcibly suppressed the many distracting thoughts, and his mind returned to its original peaceful state. Chapter 1273. The incarnation had only strengthened a little, but the power of the ripples produced by the chaotic state had increased by so much that it had almost exceeded the limit that Luo Fan could endure. It had almost wiped out all of his memories. There was only one possibility in this situation, and that was that Luo Fan's own ability was far too weak compared to the chaotic state. It was so weak that his cultivation realm's increase could not even reach the level of any increase in the chaotic state's power. It was precisely because he could not reach the level where the power of the chaos state could increase by a single unit that the power of the chaos state would have such a huge difference due to the increase in his cultivation realm. That was why the result was completely different for him. Because for the chaotic state, the smallest increase in power was the difference between the two chaotic states' power. And Luo Fan's improvement could not completely erase the difference between the two. That was why it was so strenuous for him, and why he was in such danger right now. After understanding all this, he was already relatively clear about what he should do. It was obviously impossible for him to give up on using this method to comprehend the mysteries of the chaotic state and raise his cultivation realm. However, in order to use this method, he had to do his best to ensure his safety in the face of the chaos state, so that his memories would not be erased by the power of the chaos state. In that case, he had to do his best to improve his cultivation realm and his grasp of the law of causality after remembering the inexplicable undulations produced by the chaos state. Only by raising his cultivation realm and his grasp of the law of causality to a level that could withstand the smallest increase in the chaotic state's power could he withstand the process of the chaotic state's memory being erased. Protect his memory. Therefore, this time, what was produced in that instant seemed very ordinary, very ordinary. However, it contained a faint fluctuation of infinite mysteries. Luo Fan's method of comprehension was more cautious, deeper, and more meticulous than the last time. Regarding every single ripple that was emitted, he poured all his attention into it. He poured all of his attention into every single bit of profundity. He used all of the profundities of the great Tao that he had comprehended in his entire life to comprehend the principles contained within, to make up for the many flaws in his state that he thought was already perfect. Then, he used all kinds of methods to make up for it. This method of comprehension was much more cautious than before. Naturally, the speed was many times slower than before. The last time Luo Fan sensed the ripples, it had only taken him a few days in this world. However, this time, it had taken him over 100 years. Only then did he complete the process. With Luo Fan's extreme acceleration of time, 100 years of time in this world for him was equivalent to millions or even tens of millions of years. In such a long period of time, he had completely focused his mind and attention on the fluctuations that were produced in that state of chaos. One could imagine how great the harvest was. That simple fluctuation after all these years. It had already been broken down into billions of complicated and mysterious changes. From it, Luo Fan had comprehended billions of cultivation principles. Those principles were all-encompassing and were all aimed at Luo Fan's weaknesses. Not only did it include the weaknesses of his physical and mental strength, but it also included the weaknesses of his understanding of the law of causality and his understanding of time and space. Because these weaknesses were pointed out, in these years, Luo Fan had not only completely raised his cultivation realm to the peak of level 1 pseudo-sage. In other words, he was already standing in front of the second platform. In fact, he could even vaguely touch the second platform. All he needed to do was to walk up. Moreover, he had already mastered the first level of the law of causality to the point of perfection. He was even vaguely close to the second level of the law of causality. The speed of his improvement was even faster than the speed of his cultivation realm. Apart from that, his understanding of time and space had also improved by quite a bit. The direct result of this improvement was that he was in a state of independent time dimension. The degree to which he could distort time had greatly increased compared to before. Before he started to comprehend, Luo Fan had never thought of such a huge improvement. In his original plan, if he wanted to raise his cultivation realm to the peak of level 1 pseudo-sage, he would need to send at least 10 incarnations into the state of chaos. He would need to spend at least 10 times more time to achieve that. How could it be like this? He had only used up 2 incarnations and comprehended the subtle fluctuations produced by the state of chaos twice. Yet he was still able to reach this stage. It seems that my previous cultivation was still too casual. Luo Fan felt the difference that was similar to a surprise. However, he did not feel much joy in his heart. Instead, he felt ashamed. It was naturally a happy thing to be able to achieve his cultivation goal faster than he had planned. However, from another perspective, wasn't it because he had underestimated himself? And why did he have such a low opinion of himself? Of course, it was because he did not perfectly unleash his cultivation potential in the past. He cultivated too casually, which caused him to be unable to accurately evaluate his speed of improvement when he deduced his cultivation speed based on his previous cultivation method. After sighing, Luo Fan's heart suddenly surged with a feeling of eagerness. At this moment, he felt that all the weaknesses that he had previously revealed had been completely made up for. Everything about him had reached an extremely perfect state. Even the flawless state that he was in had reached a state where the rune structure on his body, which was like a robe, could no longer be concealed. To him, this extremely perfect state was unprecedentedly powerful. He naturally wanted to see the power of this state. He wanted to understand if he could find the weaknesses in this state of chaos. With this thought in mind, Luo Fan moved his mind slightly, and an incarnation walked out of his body. This avatar exuded a flawless aura. As soon as it appeared in this world, the many grayish existences in this world began to change. The originally extremely active state seemed to have been suppressed by a terrifying power in an instant, and all the activities became much more stable. Even the many worlds in the gray and hazy world seemed to have become much more sluggish in the process. The flow of many energies seemed to have become a little sluggish, which made the cultivators and living beings of the many worlds vaguely feel that the world was different. It was as if some unimaginable change had appeared in the primal chaos they knew. For a moment, many cultivators who were regarded as supreme sages in these worlds, but were only at the pinnacle of the sage-to-be realm, began to think of ways to find the source of this change. Of course, these pinnacle of the sage-to-be realm were born in these worlds. Although they had cultivated hard and constantly surpassed their own limits, they had reached the pinnacle of the sage-to-be realm, which was the highest realm in these worlds. He obtained the ability to walk freely in this world that simulated the state of chaos. However, due to the limitations of their origins and the limitations of their knowledge of the strange gray existence that simulated the chaotic state around them, they were unable to see through the essence of this gray existence and the essence of this world. To them, this grayish existence was similar to the chaotic state in Luo Fan's eyes. This kind of dusky existence. The world that they had seen and understood was limited to the edge of their world. Even if some experts could travel across several worlds and could even open up a world in this gray world, they could only explore a range that was dozens or hundreds of times larger than other experts. Still, it was impossible for them to fully understand the truth of this world, let alone see Luo Fan, who was almost a saint in this world. Luo Fan occasionally glanced around and saw the changes happening in these worlds. He didn't know why. Suddenly, he felt an inexplicable sadness. It was not sadness for the living beings in these worlds, but sadness for himself. At this moment, he could look down on the living beings in these worlds. He could see that they were limited by their own knowledge and could not see the truth of the world. But how could he be sure that it was above him? Was there another kind of existence looking down on him? Perhaps his state was the same as the living beings born in those worlds? This sadness did not linger in his heart for long. After all, this was not the time to be immersed in this kind of sadness. With a single thought, the clone began to grow rapidly. Boundless origin chi and power were born in his body, constantly making up for his lack of power and increasing his cultivation level. He kept increasing his cultivation level, making his cultivation level rise to the level of his original body. In this process, no one knew how much time had passed. In a trance, he felt that the incarnation had already been raised to the limit. The entire incarnation had raised its cultivation realm to the same level as his body, which was the peak of level 1 pseudo-sanctuary. Without the concealment of the rune structure, the incarnation that had reached this level looked even more powerful and mysterious than the body. At first glance, the incarnation was like the center of the world, while the body was like an inconspicuous small stone beside the center of the world. This kind of change made Luo Fan quite satisfied. With a thought, this incarnation passed through the layers of barriers and entered the gap between heaven and earth and the state of chaos, directly standing in front of the layer of membrane in front of the state of chaos. Looking at this layer of membrane, Luo Fan could not help but feel a little nervous. Although he was eager to try, it did not mean that he did not know how dangerous it was to put his incarnation in. Such a shocking danger was also unbearable for Luo Fan. He even suspected that he had done this many times before. Under such circumstances, it was almost impossible for him not to be nervous. Slowly calming his rapidly beating heart, Luo Fan narrowed his eyes and was about to control the incarnation to pass through the membrane and enter the chaotic state. At this moment, an indescribable and mysterious connection was transmitted to his heart. It instantly stopped him from doing so. This mysterious connection was a spiritual connection. It did not come from the spiritual connection between this incarnation and the main body that created this incarnation. Instead, it was a kind of spiritual connection that came from another perfect world that was far away from this Earth universe. The moment Luo Fan established this spiritual connection, he knew that it was a spiritual connection from his main body in the primordial world. After sensing the contents of the spiritual connection, an inexplicable bitterness appeared on Luo Fan's face. In fact, his entire back was covered in cold sweat, which he had not seen for a long time. It has actually been repeated at least 37,241 times. This thought instantly occupied Luo Fan's mind, causing him to suddenly feel an indescribable frustration and depression. It was connected from the primordial world. It surpassed the spiritual connection that was blocked by the chaotic state. It was a memory that Luo Fan contained that made Luo Fan's hair stand on end. According to the description of the memory, at the last moment when Luo Fan, who was in the Earth universe, was about to be erased by the power that erupted from the chaotic state, he had transmitted all his memories about his incarnation to the memory of his main body in the primordial world through a mysterious spiritual connection. Before the transmission of memories this time, his main body in the primordial world, he had already received 37,240 memories that were almost exactly the same. In other words, the memory that the main body of the primordial world had transmitted this time was the same memory that Luo Fan, who was in the Earth universe, had transmitted over 37,241 times. What did this mean? It meant that when the main body in the Earth universe transmitted the memory to the main body in the primordial world, Luo Fan, he had sent 37,241 clones into the state of primal chaos and wiped them out. Due to the difference in time dimensions between the two perfect worlds, the main body of the primordial world, which was countless miles away, received the memory and then transmitted the memory to Luo Fan, who was in the Earth universe, through a mysterious spiritual connection. During the process, it was unknown how long it had been since the Earth universe had sent the same memory 37,241 times. During this period of time, how many times had Luo Fan repeated the process of sending his incarnation into the chaotic state to be killed? If he thought about it seriously, this number would probably reach a terrifying level that even Luo Fan could not accept. So that's how it is. I didn't expect that there would be such a possibility just now. This time, it actually happened. Luo Fan sighed. At this time, how could his incarnation still need to be sent into the chaotic state to court death? He turned around and took a step forward, returning to the dusky world and returning to the side of his main body. After arriving here, the incarnation shook slightly, and his body gradually melted like a snowman encountering the sun. The power contained in this incarnation was at the peak of the first-class pseudo-sage. This kind of power was emitted at this time without reservation, but it caused the countless gray existences in this world to produce an inexplicable vibration. The power of the entire world seemed to have increased a little because of this. It's actually been 1,000 years. Luo Fan secretly calculated and found that it had been 1,000 years since he had just completed the second comprehension of the chaotic state. It had already been 1,000 years. Of course, this 1,000 years was not the time of this world, but the time of the demon realm and the Earth universe. Compared to this world, this period of time had obviously exceeded hundreds of millions of years. If Luo Fan himself could change his own time, this period of time would even increase by tens of millions of times from this. It could be seen how much time Luo Fan had wasted in the process of constantly sending his incarnation into the chaotic state to be killed. Judging from the time alone, it's definitely more than 30,000 times. This number will increase by 100 times, 1,000 times, or 10,000 times. Knowing how much time had passed, Luo Fan could not help but feel a chill in his heart. After thinking about it, he turned his gaze to the creation god's palace in his universe in his sleeve and carefully observed the empty maiden who was sorting out her worldview and the creation god boy who was sleeping and cultivating. With this look, he could not help but feel a little disappointed. They did not show any signs of such a long time at all. They seemed to be the same as him, having also lost this 1,000 years of time. This result was obviously that during this 1,000 years, when his memory of his incarnation was erased, their memory of this period of time was also erased. That was why such a situation had occurred. As for why their memory was also erased, the reason was also very simple. The creation god's palace was the common magic treasure of Luo Fan and the empty maiden. In this case, The impact of the appearance of Luo Fan's incarnation on time would naturally be transmitted to the creation god's palace through Luo Fan's own memory. This would affect the creation god's palace, and the impact of the creation god's palace would naturally be transmitted to the other owner of this magic treasure, the Empty Maiden. Under such circumstances, it was obvious that the power of the chaotic state had to simultaneously erase their memories at the same time in order to truly erase the impact caused by the appearance of Luo Fan's incarnation at the same time. Chapter 1274. It's a pity that it's been 1,000 years. Luo Fan could not help but feel a sense of pity after knowing the state of the Air Maiden and the Creation Spirit Boy. However, it had already happened. It was useless to feel pity now. Luo Fan naturally would not waste too much time on it. With a thought, he immersed his mind into the memory that was transmitted from his main body in the primordial world. The memory contained an extremely large amount of information. Not only did it contain the entire process of his 37,241 incarnations being wiped out by the chaos state, but it also included the entire process of the previous 30,000 incarnations being completely wiped out by the chaos state. Of course, although there were so many incarnations, only one of them was useful to Luo Fan. After all, there was not much difference between the 37,241 incarnations. Moreover, because each incarnation was brand new to Luo Fan, their choices and responses were all the same. Under such circumstances, the fluctuations of the chaos state caused by these incarnations were naturally the same. Luo Fan carefully observed the extremely subtle fluctuations formed by the chaos state over 37,000 times. In the end, he randomly chose one of them and completely removed the memories of the entire process of the 37,000 incarnations being wiped out by the chaos state. Although Luo Fan's ability to tolerate memories was beyond imagination, even if these memories increased by 1 billion times, it would not be much pressure to him. However, these memories were meaningless to him now. Leaving them here would instead interfere with his understanding of the fluctuations and the progress of his cultivation realm. Naturally, it was better to remove them. After removing these memories, the fluctuations that were born from the chaos state that were completely targeted at his incarnation began to occupy all his mind and attention. Compared to the two fluctuations that he had encountered previously, this fluctuation was still extremely weak compared to the chaos state. It had even reached the point where it was difficult to discuss it. However, compared to Luo Fan, the power of this fluctuation was more than 100 times stronger than the last time. Between the fluctuations, the cultivation realm and strength that Luo Fan had improved were really as fragile as tofu. He had no ability to resist at all. All his actions to resist the fluctuations of the chaos state were completely disintegrated. Without any doubt, his entire incarnation was directly crushed by the fluctuations, turned into absolute nothingness, and was completely swallowed by the chaos state. Moreover, after that, the power of the chaos state to erase the existence of the incarnation increased by countless times. In order to resist the erasure power, the first level of the law of causality that Luo Fan had displayed had no ability to resist at all. It was like an egg hitting a stone. In an instant, it was crushed. The power of erasure completely erased all of Luo Fan's memories of the incarnation at a speed that he could not react to. After that, he completely forgot that he had already formed an incarnation and entered the chaos state. Instead, he thought that he had just finished his cultivation and was about to form another incarnation. Thus, he began to form another incarnation to strengthen the incarnation. He threw the incarnation into the chaos state and was then erased by the chaos state. His memories of the incarnation were erased once again. He once again forgot that he had formed an incarnation and then formed another incarnation, and so on. For such a hair-raising and heart-chilling experience, Luo Fan had already invested too much of his emotions. At this moment, he had already seen through it. This time, comprehending the memories did not bring too much emotional fluctuations to him. He just quietly comprehended the fluctuations that contained endless mysteries and principles that the chaos state had formed for his incarnation. He had already experienced it twice. This time, comprehending this fluctuation should have been a piece of cake. Everything should have gone smoothly. However, when Luo Fan entered the state of comprehension this time, he discovered that it was extremely difficult for him to comprehend the fluctuations. It was unimaginably difficult. Faced with the endless mysteries contained in the fluctuations, Luo Fan felt like an ordinary person facing an Olympiad math question in the same grade as him. Every word and every point of knowledge involved had been learned by him before. However, when they came together, they realized that no matter how hard they racked their brains and pulled out all their hair, they still couldn't answer this question. Even if the answer was right in front of them, they couldn't understand it at all. At this moment, what Luo Fan felt was how an ordinary person would feel when facing an Olympiad math question. This feeling was rather unpleasant. It instantly slowed down the progress of Luo Fan's comprehension by more than 10,000 times. Sensing the difficulty brought by the mysteries and principles contained in the fluctuations, Luo Fan instantly understood why he was so powerless in front of the fluctuations, and why his memories had been erased so many times. Although he had made considerable progress, compared to the increase in the power of the fluctuations in the chaos state, he was still lagging behind. This time, the power of the fluctuations had far exceeded the limits that he could bear. The mysteries contained in them had also surpassed the level that he could reach with his current cultivation realm. It was precisely because of this that the mysteries and principles contained in the fluctuations made Luo Fan feel this way. However, this was clearly not a bad thing. After all, the fluctuations were completely produced by Luo Fan's embodiment. It was absolutely targeted, allowing Luo Fan to comprehend the fluctuations more easily than comprehending other mysteries that were beyond his level. Under such circumstances, comprehending the fluctuations was naturally more rewarding than comprehending other mysteries of the same level. This time, Luo Fan's decomposition of the fluctuations was more detailed than before. The power of this decomposition might require several hundred units to be able to compare to the comprehension units he had obtained from the wave previously. The reason why he could do such a deep decomposition was because the mysteries and principles contained in the fluctuations this time were more profound and of a higher level. The second reason was that his cultivation realm had made great progress compared to before. The more detailed he decomposed the fluctuations, the deeper he went. The more he comprehended the mysteries, the easier it was to comprehend them. Moreover, there would be fewer places that he would miss out on. As he entered the comprehension, the space-time around his body began to change. The flow of time in Luo Fan's body began to increase rapidly. It began to increase rapidly in a way that was 100 times more resolute than before. The increase in the flow of time caused Luo Fan's body to experience more and more time at the same time in the outside world. In such a state, it was many times more difficult for him to comprehend the fluctuations than before. But on the whole, compared to the outside world, it was much more difficult. The time he spent was not much longer than before. At least, compared to the difficulty of comprehending the two, it was not that terrifying of a difference. This time, Luo Fan did not completely use these principles to improve his own cultivation realm. Instead, he used these principles to improve his cultivation realm. Instead, he used these principles to connect with the law of causality. He worked hard to deepen his understanding of the law of causality and its application. At this moment, he could see it very clearly. The reason why he was in such a difficult situation before was because the increase in his cultivation realm was not enough to offset the increase in the power of the fluctuations in the chaotic state. However, the degree of his application of the law of causality was also a very important reason. After all, if his application of the law of causality could reach the second or even the third level, it would be completely different from now. That strength would be completely different from what it was now. Perhaps it would be able to completely offset the power of the primal chaos that erased the traces of his incarnation's existence. just like the first and second time. With this thought, it was already very clear what choice Luo Fan should make. If he set his sights on this improvement, then he would naturally put as much of the gains as possible on improving his cultivation realm. That way, he would be able to achieve the greatest improvement in his cultivation realm. However, if he wanted to use this cultivation method of throwing his incarnation into the chaotic state for a long time and allow the chaotic state to produce changes that completely targeted him, then he would need to strengthen his foundation as much as possible. He would need to have a corresponding method to resist the memory erasure of the chaotic state for every bit of improvement he made. And obviously, the use of the law of causality was one of the three major supports for Luo Fan to become a pseudo-sage. Naturally, it was the foundation of the foundation. If he wanted to strengthen his cultivation foundation, how could he bypass this? The law of causality was a kind of existence that surpassed all sectors and even all perfect heaven and earth, and belonged to the chaotic state. Only in this way could the use of the law of causality resist the erasure of all traces of the existence of living beings that was born in the chaotic state, just like how only a three-dimensional existence could stop a three-dimensional existence, and a two-dimensional existence could not stop a three-dimensional existence. Three-dimensional existence was the three dimensions of length, width, and height, commonly known as three-dimensional, while two-dimensional existence only had length and width. Three-dimensional existence represented three-dimensional things that ordinary people saw, while two-dimensional existence represented things that were drawn on a piece of paper. It was precisely because the law of causality existed at this level that a cultivator could barely use the law of causality after stepping onto the 9 steps below sage and becoming a true pseudo-sage. Moreover, for ordinary cultivators, even those who reached the 8th or 9th level would not be able to advance the usage of the law of karma to the 2nd level. They would only be able to maintain the usage of the law of karma at the 1st level. From this, it could be seen how difficult it was to improve the depth of the use of the law of causality. It was even 100 times more difficult than improving one's cultivation realm. If an ordinary cultivator were to choose between improving their cultivation and deepening their utilization of the law of karma, then they would definitely be taken to be biting off more than they could chew, and they would be taken to be a stupid bear that threw away a watermelon and picked up a sesame seed. However, Luo Fan had an advantage that other cultivators did not have. This advantage gave him the qualification to choose the second option. This convenience was none other than the fact that he could form an inexplicable connection with all the vast thousand worlds, allowing him to use the law of cause and effect even more deeply than he could have done before in the vast thousand worlds. This deep use of the law of causality was not Luo Fan's true ability. Instead, it was because of the support of the heaven and earth that he was able to achieve this result. In other words, the reason why Luo Fan could use the 2nd level of the law of causality in these worlds was because of the changes in the heaven and earth itself. It was simply a result of the changes in the world itself, and it wasn't because he could truly use the law of karma to such a degree. This resulted in a result. That was this deeper use of the law of causality had its limitations. This was very obvious. This was because it was formed by the support of the heaven and earth itself. Therefore, the 2nd level of the law of causality could only be used against existences within the heaven and earth. If the existence that the law of causality was used against did not originate from the heaven and earth, but from an existence outside the heaven and earth, then the use of the law of causality would not be effective. Based on this characteristic, it was produced by the state of chaos. The power that erased Luo Fan's memories and completely erased all traces of the existence of his incarnation could not use the support of the heaven and earth to resist the 2nd level of the law of causality. The state of chaos was an existence outside the earth's universe, so it was naturally outside the heaven and earth. Precisely because of this, the situation that Luo Fan faced before was already so difficult. The power that erased his memories had already exceeded the limits of his resistance. However, he still relied on his own grasp of the law of causality to resist it, and did not use the support of the heaven and earth to use the second level of the law of causality to resist it. This was the limitation of the deep use of the law of causality under the support of the heaven and earth. However, although there were such limitations when using the law of causality, on the other hand, this kind of deep use of the law of causality was indeed a deep use of the law of causality. Therefore, the mysteries of the deeper use of the law of causality that could be comprehended from it were also real. It could allow Luo Fan to truly grasp the mysteries of the deeper use of the law of causality after he grasped it. It was precisely because of this convenient condition that Luo Fan could choose to use the law of causality between the realm of cultivation and the application of the law of causality. Luo Fan's eyes were blank, and his entire body floated in that large expanse of gray. The space-time on his body expanded and contracted like a beating heart. Although the flow of time where he was generally more than 10 million times faster than that of the outside world. However, looking at it carefully, the time dimension he was in was not fixed. In other words, the flow of time in his body. It did not stabilize to form a fixed multiple with the outside world. In fact, the time dimension that Luo Fan was in was changing at every moment. In other words, the flow of time in his body was changing at every moment. The frequency of the change, the extent of the change, the trend of the change, everything was in a state that made Luo Fan feel extremely comfortable and satisfied. In such a state, Luo Fan's body and mind were both at an extremely high peak. The efficiency of his comprehension of the waves from the chaotic state was also at an unbelievable height. Normally, he would need more than 10 days to comprehend the mysteries, but now he only needed a few dozen breaths to comprehend the mysteries. Problems that he could not understand, no matter how he thought about it, were now easily understood. Such a change happened unknowingly. In Luo Fan's own senses, it was as if the difficulty of comprehending the waves seemed to have decreased by several times during this process. That feeling was naturally rather wonderful. Time passed by slowly. After an unknown period of time, all of a sudden, an earth-shaking thunderclap rang out in this world. The thunderous sound was so loud and so wondrous that it even caused an extremely intense reaction between the heavens and the earth. The originally murky and chaotic scene completely shattered at this moment. The grayish existence was separated. The turbidity that originally did not exist appeared. With the appearance of the turbidity, the sky, the earth, the sea, the mountains, the rivers, and so on and so forth. Everything that a normal world should have appeared in an instant. In this gray existence, the numerous worlds that originally existed, the countless creatures in those worlds, including those at the pinnacle of the sage-to-be realm, who could live freely in the gray existence, freely establish their own worlds, and even the many powerful cultivators who were regarded as supreme beings by the original worlds, were completely destroyed in an instant. All of them turned into many substances in this separated turbidity world and became the material and energy foundation of this world. The whole process happened extremely quickly. From the appearance of the thunderclap to the time when Luo Fan came to his senses, only a few breaths had passed. However, within this time, the gray world that originally simulated the chaotic state had become a strange, extremely wild, and extremely primitive world with an orbicular sky and a square earth. So it's here. Let me see who exactly is stirring up the primal chaos so recklessly. When the sound of thunder gradually subsided, Luo Fan was able to distinguish that this sound of thunder was actually the clear voice of a man who was saying such a sentence. Who on earth is it? Such a thought instantly appeared in Luo Fan's mind.